Ever wondered what a day in the life of an ancient Roman senator looked like? Join me as we slowly explore the serene yet fascinating daily routines of Rome's elite. Before you dive in, make sure to subscribe and like this video so you won't miss more relaxing and intriguing historical stories from the Roman Empire. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little dusty. Something marble-lined. Something that smells faintly of olive oil, leather sandals, and maybe the faint whiff of old toga sweat. Yes, we're going to ancient Rome. But not gladiators, not Julius Caesar's big dramatic knife moment, no. We're slowing it way down. Tonight we're spending a whole evening with the most self-important men Rome ever produced. The senators. These were the men who strutted around in white togas with purple stripes, convinced the fate of the world depended on their personal opinion about taxes, grain shipments, or whether Jupiter really wanted that extra temple built. Spoiler, Jupiter didn't care. So, let's dim the lights, take a deep breath, and imagine the cobblestones of the Roman Forum at dawn. Because tonight, we're walking through the daily life of a Roman senator. Waking up, the elite Roman morning. Now, if you were a Roman senator, you did not wake up to the sound of an alarm clock. You woke up when your household slaves politely, or less politely, shook you awake. Maybe they drew back the curtains of your atrium. Maybe they opened up the wooden shutters to let in the Mediterranean sunshine. And yes, I know what you're thinking, slaves. Really? First thing in the script? Yes. Because here's the thing, if you were a senator, almost every single detail of your existence involved someone else doing things for you. You didn't put on your own sandals. You didn't even wash your own face unless you really wanted to prove a point. Picture this, a groggy senator, wrapped in a loose tunic, sitting on the edge of a fancy bed. The bed probably had a frame of ivory or bronze if he was especially rich. Maybe with some Greek-style carvings of gods that looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. A couple of slaves rush around. One hands him water to rinse his mouth. Another brings in oil to rub on his arms and legs. Yes, Romans oiled themselves instead of using soap. Then they scraped it off with a strigil, which is basically a glorified butter knife for your skin. So before he even thinks about serving the Republic or whatever noble nonsense he's supposed to be doing, a Roman senator begins the day by being scraped like a block of Parmesan. Breakfast? Or not really. The Roman idea of breakfast was minimal. They called it the ientaculum, and honestly, it was underwhelming. Bread. Maybe a bit of cheese. A couple of figs if he felt like living dangerously. And if you're picturing a senator sitting down with his family for a wholesome morning meal, think again. The senator was not the type to sit around in his pajamas, having a family chat. He was busy. Or at least pretending to be. So he might just grab a piece of yesterday's bread and wander off to his business. This also explains why senators were constantly cranky. Imagine going into a 10-hour debate on military spending after eating one stale bread roll. No wonder Rome had political assassinations. The morning procession, clients, clients, clients. Now, here comes the truly bizarre ritual of senatorial mornings. It was called the salutatio. This was basically the daily meet and greet with your fans, except the fans were technically your dependents, called clients. And instead of screaming your name, they were there to beg for money, jobs, or legal favors. Here's how it worked: a Roman senator had a group of clients, sort of like his personal entourage/fan club/beggars union. They were poorer men who depended on him for protection, little handouts, and the occasional recommendation for a job. So in the morning, they'd show up at his house. And I don't mean one or two. If he was important, we're talking dozens. Maybe even hundreds. Lining up outside the door like it was Black Friday at Walmart. The senator would put on his toga, the official, extremely uncomfortable garment of Roman public life, and go out to greet them. One by one. "Hello, Gaius. Yes, I'll see what I can do. Hello, Marcus. No, I can't lend you money again. Hello, Lucius. Nice haircut." Over and over. And in return, the clients would give him loyalty. Or at least the promise to show up and clap when he gave a speech. It was a system of mutual obligation that was less democracy and more ancient pyramid scheme. Sometimes, if the senator was feeling generous, he'd hand out a little money, known as the sportula. Basically an allowance for showing up and pretending to like him. Think of it as the Roman version of a Patreon tier. Thanks for subscribing, here's a coin. Heading to the forum. After the salutatio, the senator wasn't done with his social duties. No. He had to walk to the forum, the beating heart of Roman public life. But of course, he didn't walk alone. His clients, remember them, tagged along behind him. Picture it, a senator strutting down the street in his pristine toga, trailed by a gaggle of less impressive men hoping he'll toss them some scraps. And this was not subtle. It was a performance. Everyone in Rome could see how many clients followed you. If you had a big crowd, you looked important. If you had only 3 sad little followers, well, that was basically social death. This also meant the streets of Rome in the morning were clogged with groups of senators and their fan clubs, all trying to look more impressive than the others. It was like a never-ending political parade, except with worse fashion and more body odor. Business in the forum. Once at the forum, the senator's real day began. Or at least the part he pretended was real work. The forum was chaos. Picture a big open square surrounded by temples, basilicas, and government buildings. Then fill it with shouting politicians, lawyers harassing their clients, vendors selling bread, fortune tellers, bankers, and maybe the occasional goat wandering through. A senator here might sit on a tribunal to hear a court case. Or maybe he'd give a speech to the assembled crowd, hoping someone actually listened. Or maybe he'd just gossip with other senators about who was sleeping with whose wife. Spoiler, in Rome, the answer was usually everyone. If the Senate was in session that day, he'd eventually head into the Curia, the Senate House. And this is where the toga really earned its reputation as the world's least comfortable garment. Picture 300 men sitting in wool togas, in a building without air conditioning, in the Mediterranean summer. It smelled exactly as you're imagining. And that is just the start of a Roman senator's day. We haven't even gotten to lunch, baths, dinner parties, or the endless political backstabbing. But let's not rush. We'll float gently through the whole routine, one sweaty toga at a time. So, our senator has spent the entire morning pretending to be very busy in the forum. Maybe he listened to some speeches. Maybe he delivered one himself, quoting Greek philosophers he barely understood. Maybe he just nodded at other senators while secretly thinking about what's for lunch. Because here's the truth, for all the bluster about serving the Republic, these men lived for the next meal and the next social event. And honestly, same. Midday break, the prandium. After hours of hot air, literally and politically, the senator would eventually peel himself out of the forum and head home for lunch. The Romans called this the prandium. Now, don't expect a massive feast. Lunch was light. Bread again, obviously. Maybe some olives, cold leftovers from the previous night's dinner, a little cheese, maybe a bit of fruit. If he had a sweet tooth, dried figs or dates. Nothing extravagant, because everyone knew the real eating was saved for dinner. Still, the senator wasn't just chewing alone. He might have family members around. Maybe a few political allies dropped by. Romans loved turning even a quick bite into a networking opportunity. And if he was the type to really show off, he might nibble his bread while quoting Cicero, just to prove that he was cultured. Because nothing screams sophistication like talking about constitutional law while chewing olives. A nap, Roman style. Now, here's the best part. After lunch, Romans often took a nap. The Mediterranean sun was blazing, the forum was too hot, and honestly, they had earned it, by which I mean, they had walked around in circles for 3 hours listening to gossip. So our senator would recline on his couch, maybe with a slave fanning him gently, and doze off. The Latin word for this midday rest was meridiatio, which makes it sound much more dignified than it was. In reality, it was just a grown man taking a power nap so he could stay awake long enough to drink himself silly at dinner. And if anyone asked, oh, no, he wasn't being lazy. He was resting for the good of the Republic. The Roman bath ritual. After the nap came the real highlight of a senator's day, the baths. If you've ever imagined ancient Rome as a city of marble columns, loud arguments, and sweaty politics, well, that's true. But it was also a city of baths. Public baths, private baths, small baths, giant baths. By the late Republic and especially the Empire, going to the bath was a daily social event, not just about hygiene. So around the afternoon, our senator would head to the nearest therme, trailing a couple of attendants carrying his oils, towels, and scraping tools. And if you think modern gyms are social clubs where nobody really works out, multiply that by 10 and you've got the Roman bathhouse. Let's walk through it slowly. The apoditerium, the changing room. He strips down. Slaves take his clothes, maybe stealing a coin or two from his toga folds. It happened. The tepidarium, the warm room. Not too hot, not too cold. Just right for easing into things. He might sit and chat with friends here, catching up on the latest scandals. Who bribed who? Which general was stealing from the treasury? Which senator's daughter was scandalously hanging out with gladiators? Spoiler, always at least one. The caldarium, the hot room. Think sauna, but with steam. The senator sweats buckets. Slaves rub oil on him again. Another scrapes it off. This was their version of exfoliation, except done with the elegance of peeling a carrot. The frigidarium, the cold plunge. After sweating, he dunks into a freezing pool. It's bracing. It wakes him up. And it probably made him feel like a brand new man, at least until the next round of political bickering. And then there was exercise, of course. Wrestling. Ball games. Light weightlifting with dumbbells made of stone. But let's be honest, a senator in his 40s or 50s wasn't really here to wrestle sweaty young men in the dirt. He was here to network. So, half bathing, half politicking, the senator spent his afternoon in the steamy marble halls of the baths. Late afternoon, more business. After the bath, he might have a few more official duties. Maybe a court case to attend. Maybe a meeting with allies about pushing a law through. Maybe just sitting in the Senate chamber, pretending to listen while doodling on his wax tablet. This was the part of the day where he juggled the endless demands of Roman public life. One friend wanted a loan. Another wanted him to back a candidate. Someone else wanted a priesthood for their nephew who was 12 and still picking his nose. And through it all, the senator had to look serious, even when he secretly wished he were back at the baths with a glass of wine. The Cena, Roman dinner parties. Finally, evening arrived, and with it, the highlight of Roman elite life, the Cena, or dinner. Now, let me set the stage. Roman dinner parties were not about food. At least, not mainly. They were about status. About who you invited, how fancy the dishes were, and how much Greek poetry you could quote without choking on a grape. The senator's household would prepare all afternoon. Slaves rushing to set up couches, polishing the silver, arranging flowers. Maybe they hired musicians, maybe a poet to recite verses, maybe a dancer. All to make the evening look effortless when in fact it was a logistical nightmare. Guests would arrive, and everyone would recline on couches in groups of 3. Yes, they ate lying down, propped on one elbow, which sounds elegant until you actually try it and realize your back hurts after 5 minutes. But Romans thought sitting was for barbarians. Reclining was for civilized people. The meal itself had multiple courses. Gustatio, appetizers. Eggs, salads, oysters if you were really fancy. Maybe mulsum, which was wine sweetened with honey. Prima mensa, the main course. Meat, fish, vegetables. If the senator wanted to show off, exotic dishes like peacock tongues or dormice stuffed with nuts. Yes, Romans ate dormice. No, it wasn't ironic. Secunda mensa, dessert. Fruits, nuts, honey cakes. But again, the food was just the stage. The real performance was in the conversation. Guests debated philosophy. They gossiped about politics. They flattered the host. They occasionally sang, recited poetry, or tried to show off some obscure bit of Greek trivia. And, of course, they drank. Romans diluted their wine with water, but they drank it steadily through the evening. Too much, and you looked like a fool. Too little, and you looked boring. The trick was to stay just tipsy enough to make clever remarks without falling asleep on the couch. Winding down. By the time the Cena wound down, it was late. Guests staggered home with their slaves holding torches to light the way. The senator, meanwhile, finally got to collapse into his bed. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again, the salutatio, the forum, the baths, the dinner. Over and over. A life of ritual, obligation, and endless posturing. And yet, for all its pomp, the life of a Roman senator was really just about 2 things, keeping power, and looking like you deserved it. Imagine it's late at night. The Cena has wrapped up, the guests are gone, the wine has dulled the edge of politics, and our senator finally stumbles back into his domus, the great Roman townhouse. You'd think that behind closed doors he'd get peace. But no. Roman homes were basically revolving stages of family drama, slaves rushing about, and endless relatives who never seemed to leave. The senator's house, more hotel than home. The senator's house wasn't cozy. It was a statement piece. From the outside, it looked kind of plain, a blank wall with a big door. Romans didn't care about curb appeal. But once you stepped inside, boom. Atrium. Open roof. A little pool of water to catch the rain, because why not design your house to leak on purpose? This atrium was the center of family life, but also public life. Senators used their houses like office lobbies. Clients and visitors poured in here, waiting for the morning salutation. Family portraits hung on the walls, wax masks of ancestors with disturbingly realistic features. Because nothing says, "Welcome to my home," like being stared down by 50 generations of dead people. Deeper inside, there were dining rooms, bedrooms, maybe a peristyle garden if the senator was rich enough. A colonnade with fountains, flowers, and a little courtyard where he could show off imported Greek statues. Because every Roman elite wanted you to know he'd been to Athens once and bought something expensive. But again, this wasn't private in the way we think of private. Roman senators lived in semi-public homes, with clients, slaves, tutors, and random cousins wandering in and out. If you wanted alone time, good luck. Marriage, partnership, business deal, or cage. Now, what about the senator's wife? Roman senators usually married in their late teens or 20s. Their wives? Often much younger. 14 was common. 16 was practically mature. It wasn't about love, of course. It was about alliances, family power, and making sure the next generation of heirs was securely locked down. So picture the senator, maybe 30, balding, with a toga gut. His wife. A teenager trained to manage his household, smile at his dinner guests, and produce as many children as humanly possible. Romantic, right? That said, Roman wives weren't shrinking violets. Elite women like Clodia, Julia, or Livia could wield serious influence. They ran the household accounts, managed slaves, and often pulled strings behind the scenes. A clever senator's wife could make or break his career. But still, marriage could be tense. Divorce was common. If things went south, a senator could simply send his wife's things back to her father and call it a day. No need for a court battle. And considering Roman men were not exactly famous for fidelity, yes, prostitutes, mistresses, and the occasional slave girl were all part of the normal scene, you can imagine how many Roman marriages were less candlelit romance and more Cold War. Children, spoiled, sickly, or both. Then came the children. Roman senators needed heirs. Sons to carry the family name, daughters to marry off in more dynastic deals. But raising them was complicated. Infant mortality was brutal. A senator might have 6 children, but only 2 survived past childhood. And if they did survive, they were usually pampered to absurdity. Sons were treated like little emperors in training. Tutors drilled them in Greek, Latin, and rhetoric from the age of 7. By 12, they were expected to declaim speeches about the Punic Wars, which must have been a real thrill at family gatherings. And daughters? Well, Their education focused more on spinning wool, running a household, and memorizing how to look modest in public. Which didn't stop some from developing very unmodest reputations later. Here's the thing, senatorial children were both spoiled and suffocated. Surrounded by slaves, nannies, and tutors, they grew up in luxury but with constant pressure to succeed. And honestly, it produced some pretty odd personalities. Take young Nero, for instance, raised in luxury, surrounded by sycophants, and we all know how that turned out. The household staff. An army in tunics. Let's not forget the real engine of the senator's household, the slaves. A big senatorial household had dozens, even hundreds. Cooks, cleaners, scribes, tutors, doorkeepers, torchbearers, gardeners, hairdressers, masseurs, even a guy whose only job was to stand at the door and bark at visitors. Slaves ran every detail. They lit the lamps at night, fanned the senator during dinner, and stood by his bed in case he needed water at 3 a.m. They were the ancient equivalent of Siri, except human and resentful. And yes, senators could be cruel. Some were casually brutal, punishing slaves for mistakes. Others were oddly indulgent, treating favorite slaves almost like family. But either way, the senator's private life was never private. Every argument with his wife, every moment of sickness, every late-night sigh, witnessed by slaves who had no choice but to be there. Evening entertainment at home. Not every night was a dinner party. Some evenings, the senator stayed in. But quiet night in Rome still meant noise. He might call for musicians, flutes, lyres, maybe a harp. Or he'd have a slave read out loud from Homer or Virgil, because what better bedtime story than the 10-year siege of Troy? Or, if he was feeling particularly vain, he'd force his children to listen to his own speeches, practicing for the next Senate debate. Nothing like tucking your kids in with a 40-minute rant about grain tariffs. If he wanted intimacy, he might talk with his wife about family alliances, or whisper about which senator was doomed in the next election. But more often, that intimacy came from a slave girl conveniently sent to his room. Because again, Roman morality was less, family values, and more, don't get caught embarrassing yourself in public. Nightfall. Eventually, the oil lamps burned low. The senator retired to his bedroom, the cubiculum. It wasn't large, Romans didn't think bedrooms should be luxurious. Just a bed, maybe a chair, a chest, and some grim ancestral mask staring down from the wall. Perfect for a restful night. And there he slept, knowing that at dawn the whole cycle would begin again. The salutatio. The forum. The baths. The cena. Over and over, until he dropped dead from old age, stress, or one too many oysters at dinner. Because the daily life of a Roman senator wasn't about glory. It was about routine. Endless, performative, exhausting routine. The Senate was supposed to be Rome's council of wise elders. The very word senator comes from senex, meaning old man. Which already tells you this was not a young man's game. But the reality? Rome's Senate was a mixed bag. Yes, there were some brilliant statesmen. But there were also senile aristocrats clinging to power, paranoid schemers, men who got rich selling grain at double price during famines, and the occasional loudmouth who thought quoting Greek poetry made him clever. Let's meet a few of these toga-clad oddballs. Cato the Younger, the walking lecture. First up, Marcus Porcius Cato, better known as Cato the Younger. If you've ever had a coworker who insists on doing things the proper way, even when it makes life miserable, congratulations. You've basically met Cato. Cato was famous for his rigid morality. He dressed simply, wore no perfume, went barefoot sometimes, and generally behaved as though he were auditioning for the role of grumpy philosopher who ruins every party. At Senate meetings, he lectured constantly. He was that guy who always has his hand raised. And every speech ended with the same line, no matter what the topic was: Carthage must be destroyed. It didn't matter if they were discussing taxes, aqueducts, or what color marble to use in the new temple. Cato would find a way to pivot back to his obsession. Nice speech, Senator. But have you considered that Carthage is still standing? The man was relentless. He died before Carthage was finally destroyed, but you just know he would have been smug about it. Cicero, the overachiever with anxiety. Then there was Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero. Or, as he thought of himself, Rome's greatest orator. Cicero was not from one of the old noble families. He was a novus homo, a new man, meaning the first in his family to make it to the Senate. And he was painfully aware of it. So Cicero worked twice as hard. He studied rhetoric, philosophy, and law until he could talk circles around anyone. His speeches were legendary, elegant, witty, persuasive. He was the kid who not only did the homework but color-coded it. But beneath the polish, Cicero was insecure. He obsessed over his reputation. He wrote endless letters to friends complaining about how nobody appreciated him enough. If Cicero had lived today, he would have been the guy refreshing Twitter at 2 a.m. to see how many likes his clever comment got. And for all his brilliance, his career was a roller coaster: consul at the top of the Republic one year, exiled the next, crawling back, then assassinated when things got too chaotic. The Senate was not kind to anxious overachievers. Lucius Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Some senators weren't obsessed with morality or speeches. Some were obsessed with money. Take Marcus Licinius Crassus. Known, quite literally, as the richest man in Rome. Crassus had so much wealth that he could fund armies out of pocket. But he wasn't exactly subtle about how he got it. For example, he made a fortune buying up the houses of people whose property conveniently burned down in Rome's frequent fires. How? By running his own private fire brigade. Yes, when a fire broke out, Crassus's men would show up. And instead of putting out the flames, they'd negotiate. Nice house you've got there. Shame if it burned down. Sell it to Crassus for cheap, and maybe we'll do something about it. It was basically real estate extortion with bucket brigades. And senators just nodded and called him enterprising. Crassus used his wealth to buy influence in the Senate, but he was never taken as seriously as the bold noble types. They saw him as vulgar. Which is ironic, considering half of them were secretly doing the same shady stuff, just with more marble statues to cover it up. Seneca, the philosopher hypocrite. Another gem in the senatorial lineup was Seneca the Younger. Stoic philosopher. Playwright. Advisor to emperors. On paper, Seneca preached simplicity, moderation, and detachment from wealth. In practice, he was drowning in wealth. Palaces, estates, money-lending operations. He even lent money to British tribes at outrageous interest rates, which helped spark a rebellion. So, imagine this man standing in the Senate, solemnly quoting Stoic philosophy about virtue and modesty, while wearing a toga woven from silk imported at enormous expense. It was the Roman version of a wellness influencer telling you to simplify your life, while filming from a mansion in Malibu. Senators in general, the gossip addicts. And then there were the nameless masses of senators, not the big names we remember, but the everyday toga wearers. What did they do? Mostly gossip. The Senate wasn't just politics. It was an ancient rumor mill. Senators spread whispers about who was sleeping with whom, who bribed the jury, who faked an omen, whose toga looked suspiciously cheap that day. Because in Rome, politics and gossip were the same thing. And reputations could make or break a man faster than a bad speech. The senatorial ego. What tied them all together, from Cato's lectures to Cicero's insecurities to Crassus's greed, was ego. Senators believed they were the guardians of Rome's greatness. In reality, half of them were just scrambling for attention, money, and influence. It was a room full of self-important men who could argue for 6 hours about whether to spend state funds on a new aqueduct, and then go home to lecture their kids on humility. The hypocrisy was part of the uniform. And so, when we picture the Roman Senate, we shouldn't imagine a solemn hall of marble statues come to life. We should imagine a chaotic, sweaty chamber of human quirks, the stubborn, the insecure, the greedy, the hypocritical, all wrapped in itchy wool togas, convinced the republic would collapse without their personal brilliance. Rome was a city obsessed with calendars. Every day was marked as lucky or unlucky, sacred to one god or another, full of rules about what could or couldn't be done. And senators? They had to perform on this calendar like it was their full-time job. The endless sacrifices. Let's start with religion. Rome was a city of gods, dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands, depending on how generous you are with counting household spirits. And senators were expected to lead the way in honoring them. So imagine this, our senator, up at dawn, not for politics this time, but to preside over a sacrifice. He stands there in his toga, flanked by priests, while a nervous-looking pig, sheep, or bull is brought forward. The poor animal gets its throat cut, the entrails are inspected for omens, and the senator has to pretend he knows what a healthy-looking liver even looks like. Because yes, Romans believed the future could be read in animal guts. If the liver was smooth and shiny, good omen. If it looked weird, bad omen. And the senator was expected to nod seriously, as though this was cutting-edge political science. All of this happened in front of crowds. The smoke of the sacrifice went up, the senator gave a little speech about honoring Jupiter or Mars, and then the meat was distributed. For the people, it was free barbecue. For the senator, it was another box checked on the endless list of civic duties. The ludi, public games, or how to burn money with style. Next on the calendar, the games. Rome loved public games, ludi. Chariot races, gladiator fights, theatrical performances. And guess who got to fund them? Yep. Senators. If you were rich enough, you might sponsor a set of games yourself. It was the ancient equivalent of buying naming rights to a stadium. Except instead of a plaque with your name on it, you got 1,000 citizens chanting your praises while they watched slaves fight to the death. Take the Circus Maximus, Rome's massive chariot racing stadium. Picture our senator sitting in the front row, clients crowding behind him, while teams of horses thundered around the track. Factions cheered, reds, blues, greens, whites, the ancient version of football hooligans, but with more risk of tripping over a toga. And senators weren't just passive spectators. They were expected to be seen, to wave, to cheer, to be visible symbols of Rome's grandeur. It was free entertainment for the masses, but it was also political theater. Miss a big game, and people noticed. Religious festivals, basically, Rome took every excuse for a party. Rome's calendar was cluttered with festivals. Saturnalia, Lupercalia, Perilia, Floralia, every god seemed to have their own excuse for a citywide holiday. Saturnalia was the big one. December, honoring Saturn, god of time and agriculture. Work stopped, gifts were exchanged, slaves got to play at being masters for a day, and senators had to put on a show of generosity. It was basically Roman Christmas plus April Fool's Day rolled into one. Lupercalia, in February, was stranger. Priests ran around the city nearly naked, whipping people with strips of goat hide to bring fertility. Senators had to watch this with a straight face, pretending it was all very dignified. It was not. Floralia, honoring the goddess of flowers, was full of games, theater, and sometimes dancers shedding their clothes in public. Again, senators sat in the audience pretending this was a solemn religious ritual and not just free burlesque. For every festival, senators had a role, giving speeches, sponsoring games, offering sacrifices, or just showing up to be seen. Because in Rome, absence was as dangerous as presence. If you weren't there, people wondered why. Seasonal politics. The senatorial year also followed political cycles. Elections were a summer spectacle. Candidates in bright togas bribed voters, shook hands, and promised impossible things. Senators had to endorse, maneuver, or outright sabotage rivals. Winter was quieter, the campaigning season slowed down, armies went into quarters, and senators had more time for dinner parties and scheming indoors. Spring brought new military campaigns. Summer was for grain shipments and debates about whether to raise taxes. In other words, the year was a carousel of politics, religion, and spectacle. Our senator never really got a break. Even when the calendar said holiday, it just meant another excuse to put on his best toga and act like the republic was still running smoothly. Private seasons at home. And at home, the senator's household had its own rhythms. Spring meant planting and overseeing estates in the countryside. Harvest time meant supervising workers. Or, more often, sending a steward to do it while the senator stayed in Rome complaining about the heat. Family milestones were marked with little ceremonies. A newborn's dies lustricus, when the baby got its name. A boy's toga virilis ceremony around age 15, when he swapped the child's toga for the man's toga and immediately started acting insufferable. A daughter's marriage, which was basically another political deal signed over wine. The household was never still. Rituals, ceremonies, constant turnover of slaves, endless visits from relatives, it was like living inside a calendar that never stopped flipping. The year's end. By the end of the year, our senator was exhausted. He had attended sacrifices, endured festivals, sat through Senate debates, hosted dinners, sponsored games, bribed voters, yelled at clients, argued with his wife, and maybe even tried to read some Stoic philosophy about inner peace. And then, Just when he thought he could relax, the calendar reset. Saturnalia came around again. More gifts, more rituals, more obligations. For a senator, life wasn't about individual days. It was about endless cycles of performance, public and private, all carefully staged to convince Rome that he was indispensable. Old age in the forum. Let's start with the obvious. Senators didn't really retire. In theory, yes, you could fade into the background after holding your big magistracies. You'd already been consul, praetor, censor, you had your honors, your name inscribed on the official lists. But Rome wasn't the kind of place where people just stopped showing up. Even in their 70s or 80s, senators often dragged themselves to the forum, leaning on slaves, squinting at the scrolls, and pretending they still had the sharp wit of their younger years. Because absence meant irrelevance, and irrelevance was worse than death. Cato the Elder was notorious for this. Well into his senior years, he was still making cranky speeches in the Senate about how indulgent everyone had become. He'd end every speech. Literally every speech, with, "And Carthage must be destroyed." Imagine being that guy at dinner, muttering the same talking point until everyone stopped inviting you. The Stoic stage of life. Philosophy became fashionable in old age. Younger senators might dabble in rhetoric and poetry, but once gray hairs showed up, suddenly everyone was a Stoic. Because nothing said, "I'm still relevant," like quoting Greek philosophy in a calm monotone. Senators would hire philosophers to tutor their sons, then start parroting those same lessons themselves. Oh yes, wealth is meaningless, power is an illusion, we must live in harmony with nature. This, of course, while reclining in a marble villa funded by enslaved labor, sipping Falernian wine. But hey, the thought counts. Cicero, ever the chatterbox, wrote treatises about old age itself, claiming it wasn't so bad. Easy for him to say, he had estates, libraries, and an ego large enough to pretend people were still listening. Family, heirs, and the eternal problem of sons. For old senators, family became the focus. Specifically, making sure your legacy didn't collapse the moment you died. That meant one thing, the heir. Ideally, you had a son who was competent enough to carry on the name, marry well, and not squander the family fortune on dice and dancers. Unfortunately, Roman sons were not known for their restraint. If you didn't have one, adoption was the solution. Adoption wasn't just for children, a senator could adopt a grown man, often a nephew or ambitious young ally, and legally slot him in as heir. Augustus himself was adopted, and he built an empire out of it. So in old age, our senators spent a lot of time managing wills, dowries, marriage contracts, basically, trying to control the uncontrollable. And if you think modern family drama is bad, imagine combining it with politics, slaves, and divine omens. That's Roman inheritance planning. The decline of the body. Let's be honest, Rome wasn't gentle on old bones. The diet was rich, the wine flowed constantly, and medicine was basically herbs, amulets, and prayers to Apollo. Arthritis, gout, failing eyesight, all common. Cato bragged about chewing onions to stay healthy. Others believed in cold baths. But really, once you passed 60, you were mostly at the mercy of whatever the gods decided. Still, old senators often pushed themselves into public life until the very end. There was prestige in being the gray-haired elder still barking in the Senate, even if half the room was secretly hoping you'd keel over mid-speech. The Roman deathbed. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. Death in Rome wasn't private. When a senator lay dying, the family gathered, clients showed up, even neighbors sometimes drifted in. It was part farewell tour, part witness statement. If he had the strength, the senator might give a final speech, a little homily about duty, honor, the gods. If he didn't, the philosophers were quoted for him. Either way, it was staged. Because Romans hated the idea of a death without an audience. The funeral show. Funerals were public theater. The body was displayed in the atrium of the house, laid out in the ancestral masks and surrounded by flowers. Relatives paraded the corpse through the streets, actors sometimes wearing wax masks of the senator's ancestors to represent the family line, which was equal parts moving and creepy. If the senator had been especially important, the funeral procession ended in the forum. There, a relative gave a speech, the laudatio funebris, retelling his career, his virtues, his triumphs. This was less about honoring the dead and more about advertising the family's continued importance. Then came burial or cremation, usually outside the city walls. And with that, the senator finally stopped attending meetings, at least in person. Memory and legacy. But Rome wasn't done with him. His name might be inscribed on monuments, his statues set up in the forum, his deeds recorded in annals. His family would display his wax mask on ceremonial occasions, reminding everyone that their line was ancient and respectable. Some senators got lucky and were remembered kindly. Others were mocked by historians, gossiped about by poets, or quietly erased when their families fell from favor. Legacy in Rome was fragile, always at the mercy of whoever got to write the last line. The eternal cycle. And so, from youth to old age, the senator's life was never really his own. It was shaped by ritual, obligation, expectation. His days were planned, his years were full, and even his death was another performance for Rome's endless stage. One life ended, another began. A son, or an adopted heir, stepped into the toga and took his place in the forum. The cycle spun on, just as it always had. Because Rome didn't need individuals. Rome needed senators. And senators, for all their power, were really just actors in a play that never stopped running. The Roman marriage market. Let's begin with marriage. For a senator, marriage was never about romance. It was about politics. You married to secure alliances, combine estates, and produce heirs who could keep the family line relevant. So picture our senator at 20, being introduced to a bride of maybe 14. She came with a dowry, a famous family name, and probably zero interest in him. But that didn't matter. The match was approved by fathers, sealed with contracts, and celebrated with a wedding feast that looked fun in paintings but was probably awkward in real life. And while we like to imagine stoic Roman marriages, the reality was messy. Divorce was easy, just declare it, return the dowry, and move on. Senators went through multiple wives in a lifetime, sometimes because of death in childbirth, sometimes because a new political opportunity came along. Love wasn't the point. Connections were. Though every now and then, scandalous letters hint that a senator actually did care for his wife, or, at least, cared enough to get jealous when she ran off with a gladiator. The children, precious, spoiled, or doomed. Children in senatorial households were miniature projects. Sons were the future. From birth, they were surrounded by nurses, tutors, and expectations. By 7, they were learning Latin and Greek. By 12, they were quoting Homer at dinner parties. By 15, they were wearing the toga of manhood and already practicing speeches in front of their father's clients. Daughters, meanwhile, were bargaining chips. Pretty, pious, obedient, at least, that was the ideal. By puberty, they were married off to secure alliances. A senator might dote on a daughter, but she was still part of the political toolkit. And infant mortality was high. Even the wealthy lost children. So alongside the tutors and nurses, there was always the shadow of grief. Roman epitaphs for children are heartbreaking, parents praising a child who lived only 5 years, or less. Senators played their part in public, but at home, loss was constant. The mistress question. Of course, senators weren't exactly paragons of fidelity. Slaves were always available, mistresses were tolerated, and prostitutes worked openly. A senator could stray without much scandal, as long as he didn't cross certain lines. Sleeping with another senator's wife. Big scandal. Sleeping with actors. Embarrassing, since actors were seen as socially low. Augustus famously passed moral laws trying to rein in elite promiscuity. Did it work? Not really. Senators still carried on with affairs, wrote terrible poetry about them, and pretended to be shocked when rumors spread. The hypocrisy was part of the performance. Publicly, the senator was dignified. Privately, he might be sneaking off to the Subura, the city's seedy quarter, for a night that definitely wouldn't make it into his funeral speech. The villa escape. When Rome got overwhelming, the noise, the stink, the endless politics, senators fled to their country villas. The villa was the ultimate flex. Rolling hills, olive groves, vineyards, slaves running the estate. Some senators even pretended to farm in a rustic, philosophical way, while actually outsourcing everything to overseers. Cato the Elder liked to write farming manuals, but let's be honest, he wasn't plowing fields himself. At the villa, life slowed down. There were reading rooms, gardens, baths, mosaics of dolphins and gods. Senators invited friends, recited poetry, and pretended to be philosophers, while drinking enough wine to float a trireme. It was escape, but also stagecraft. Because every villa visit turned into a story about how cultured, refined, and connected you were. Hobbies, or the things that passed for fun. So what did senators actually do for leisure? Hunting, boars, deer, even lions imported for sport. Because nothing says civilization like watching your aristocratic neighbor get mauled by wildlife. Reading and writing, collecting Greek scrolls, scribbling mediocre poetry, quoting philosophers at dinner. Cicero turned it into a career, but most senators were amateur show-offs. Gambling, technically frowned upon, but dice games were everywhere. Senators pretended to be above it, then lost a fortune in a single night. Food experiments, wealthy Romans loved exotic dishes. Dormice stuffed with honey, flamingo tongues, garum, the fermented fish sauce that made neighbors complain for miles. Hosting a dinner with unusual food was a flex. None of this was about fun in the modern sense. It was about proving status. A senator's hobbies were performances of wealth, education, and power. Gossip and reputation. Behind closed doors, senators feared gossip more than death. Rome thrived on rumors. Who was sleeping with whom? Who was in debt? Who got too drunk at dinner? Satirical poets sharpened their pens on the elite, and senators lived in terror of becoming the next punchline. One wrong word at a banquet, one scandalous affair, and you might hear your name whispered in the forum, or worse, immortalized in juvenile satire. Reputation was fragile, and senators curated their private lives with as much care as their public ones. Of course, half of them still blundered into scandal anyway. The private man, the public mask. And that's really the essence of a senator's private life. It wasn't private. Not really. Every choice, wife, mistress, villa, hobby, even how you treated your slaves, fed into your public reputation. Your clients noticed. Your rivals noticed. The poets noticed. And if you lived long enough, the historians noticed. So behind closed doors, the senator was never truly free. He was always performing, even when he thought no one was watching. Rome made sure of that. Corruption as a lifestyle. Let's start with money. Every senator was supposed to be fabulously wealthy, but wealth was never enough. There were estates to expand, debts to pay, temples to build, and games to sponsor. So senators constantly skirted the line of corruption. Governors of provinces, for example, often treated their posts as open shopping trips. Taxes adjusted upward, bribes accepted, fortunes squeezed out of terrified locals. And when they returned to Rome, they had to face trials for extortion. Cicero made a career prosecuting men like Verres, whose mismanagement of Sicily was so cartoonishly corrupt it almost became satire. Of course, if you had friends in high places, you could usually bribe your way out. Rome had laws, but laws bent easily when gold was involved. Corruption wasn't an accident, it was the system. Exile, the senator's retirement plan nobody wanted. If corruption didn't catch you, politics did. Exile was the go-to punishment for senators who annoyed the wrong people. Sometimes it was a convenient escape from a trial. Sometimes it was forced by a rival's scheming. Either way, one day you were in the forum, the next you were on a ship to some island you couldn't spell. Cicero himself was exiled briefly, and he complained about it at great length, as only Cicero could. Others ended up on barren rocks in the Aegean, or in the backwater towns of Asia Minor, living out their days writing bitter letters about ungrateful Rome. It wasn't death, but it was social death. Your clients drifted away, your house in Rome was sold, and your rivals divided your influence like vultures. When emperors arrived. And then came the emperors. Under the Republic, senators at least pretended to share power. Once Augustus set up shop, that illusion shrank fast. The Senate still met, still debated, but real authority was in the emperor's hands. Some emperors played nice. Augustus and Antoninus Pius preferred to flatter the Senate, giving them roles to keep their dignity intact. Others, Caligula, Nero, Domitian, treated the Senate like a chew toy. Senators were humiliated, forced to applaud idiotic performances, and executed on whims. Imagine being a senator under Caligula, told to show up at the palace just to watch the emperor prance around in a golden toga, or under Nero, forced to clap politely at his endless lyre recitals. Refuse, and you'd be accused of treason. Clap too little, same problem. Rome invented the no-win workplace. Conspiracies and the axe. Of course, some senators fought back, usually with terrible results. Conspiracies brewed constantly. Plots to assassinate emperors, restore the republic, or at least get a less embarrassing tyrant in charge. The Piso conspiracy under Nero was one of the most famous, involving dozens of senators, equestrians, even poets. They planned to kill Nero and replace him. It failed, spectacularly. Most conspirators ended up executed or forced to open their veins in the Roman fashion. That was the other fate of unlucky senators, state-sanctioned suicide. The emperor graciously allowed you to kill yourself rather than be dragged to trial. It was sold as an honor, but really, it was just an efficient way to get rid of troublemakers without looking too messy. The culture of fear. So imagine our senator, older now, sitting in the curia under a suspicious emperor. Every word measured, every glance weighed. Applause when the emperor looked your way, silence when he didn't. Behind the scenes, whispers of plots, rumors of purges, fear of spies. And yet, they kept showing up. Because the Senate was tradition. It was identity. Even reduced to a ceremonial role, senators still clung to their togas and titles, pretending they mattered. And in some ways, they did, at least enough to keep emperors nervous. The senatorial endgame. So the darker truth of senatorial life is this: it wasn't just boring dinners, stuffy debates, and endless rituals. It was also corruption, exile, disgrace, and sometimes a very public death. Some senators managed to navigate it all, cautious, flattering, wealthy, never too bold. Others went down in flames, remembered in history books for their spectacular failures more than their successes. Either way, the Senate endured. Not because senators were brilliant or noble, but because Rome loved the idea of the Senate too much to let it go. It was theater, even in the darkest days. The curtain falls. And so we drift to the end. The daily life of a Roman senator was full of ritual and routine, but behind it all was a constant tension. Wealth was fragile. Power was dangerous. The emperor's favor was fickle. And the same toga that gave a man prestige could also mark him out for execution. It was a life of performance, in the forum, at home, in the games, and even in death. A senator was never free. But he was always part of Rome's endless story. And in the quiet of the night, when the lamps burned low and the city finally fell silent, maybe he wondered if it had all been worth it. Omens everywhere. Romans couldn't walk across the street without checking for signs from the gods. For a senator, omens weren't background noise. They were political ammunition. If the sacred chickens refused to eat, you postponed a battle. If lightning struck near the Capitol, you debated what it meant in the Senate. So imagine our senator heading to a vote, only to be told that a sacred hen looked grumpy that morning. Suddenly, nothing could proceed. Business paused until the priests decided whether Jupiter was frowning or just bored. This constant search for divine signals meant senators often carried private fears. A sneeze, a stumble, a bad dream, all could be twisted into warnings. And if you ignored them, you risked both the gods' anger and your colleagues' gossip. Household gods and daily rituals. At home, belief was intimate. Every senatorial house had a shrine to the Lares and Penates, the protective household gods. Each morning, the senator dropped offerings, wine, incense, maybe a bit of bread. Small rituals, but they stitched his private life to the divine. Even meals began with libations. Before that first sip of wine, a drop was poured out for the gods. Because in Rome, no moment was too small for a ritual. Forgetting one was more than sloppy, it was unlucky. Ghosts and the dead. Romans were deeply haunted by their ancestors. Literally. They believed in spirits of the dead, manes, who lingered around the living. Every year, families performed ceremonies at tombs, offering food and garlands. A senator might visit the family mausoleum outside the city, whispering prayers to keep restless ancestors happy. There were also darker fears. Malicious ghosts, restless shades, even tales of specters appearing in houses. Wealthy senators weren't above hiring exorcists or moving villas after a string of bad dreams. The afterlife wasn't abstract. It was uncomfortably close. Philosophy as armor. Still, many senators tried to rise above superstition with philosophy. Stoicism was especially fashionable. It offered dignity in the face of chaos, accept fate, endure hardship, focus on virtue. Senators quoted Epictetus and Seneca as if calm words could shield them from imperial paranoia. Others leaned toward Epicureanism, not party hard, but seek tranquility. Avoid politics if possible, enjoy simple pleasures, and don't fear death. Of course, avoiding politics was impossible for senators, but they liked to talk about it at banquets as though it was a real option. Philosophy was less about practice, more about image. To sit in your library, scroll in hand, pretending to be above ambition, it was the ultimate elite flex. Astrology and fortune-tellers. Despite all this, even the most serious senators couldn't resist astrology. Greek astrologers thrived in Rome, casting horoscopes for anyone with coin. Senators secretly consulted them about elections, marriages, and military campaigns. Officially, Augustus banned astrologers who predicted imperial deaths. Unofficially, half the Senate still had star charts tucked in their desks. Even emperors joined in. Tiberius was obsessed with astrology, and senators nervously learned to talk planets as fluently as politics. Because nothing was more dangerous than rolling your eyes at the emperor's horoscope. The fear of forgetting. Beneath it all, the senator's greatest fear wasn't poverty or even exile. It was being forgotten. Everything, the rituals, the philosophy, the pomp, was about memory. Your name carved on stone, your mask carried at funerals, your deeds mentioned in speeches. To be remembered was survival. To be forgotten was annihilation. So when our senator burned incense to the Lares, or nodded gravely at omens, or wrote a stiff little treatise on virtue, it was all part of that same hunger. To leave something behind. To matter, even after the body was ash. The quiet within. And yet, in rare moments, there was quiet. Perhaps in the villa garden at dusk, staring at olive trees while cicadas hummed. Perhaps in the dim atrium, incense smoke curling toward the ceiling. For just a breath, the senator might believe the philosophers, that fate was fixed, that peace was possible, that life was more than endless ritual. Then the next morning, the forum called again. More omens, more debates, more masks to wear. Because for a Roman senator, belief was never just private. It was woven into politics, family, and survival. And so, even in his inner world, he was never truly free. Slaves, the unseen workforce. Every senator's household was a small empire. And at the core of that empire were slaves. Not a handful. Dozens, sometimes hundreds. There were cooks, gardeners, scribes, teachers, cleaners, stable boys, doorkeepers, bath attendants, and flute players for dinner entertainment. Each one had a role, each one was invisible in public. For the senator, their presence was as natural as furniture. You didn't think about who cleaned your mosaic floor, you just admired how shiny it looked when guests arrived. Slaves woke before dawn. They cleaned lamps, swept courtyards, and prepared the senator's morning bath. By the time he opened his eyes, the house was already humming like a machine. He never noticed the labor, which was exactly the point. Household hierarchy. Roman slaves had their own pecking order. At the top were the familia urbana, the city slaves. Secretaries, accountants, even librarians. A trusted secretary might control his master's letters and finances, wielding quiet influence. At the bottom were the hard laborers, kitchen drudges, stable hands, and the unlucky ones chained in workshops. Their lives were cramped, dirty, and short. Some slaves wore fine tunics and dined indoors. Others slept in cellars, listening to the footsteps of banquets above them. Same household. Different universes. The trusted ones. A senator's most trusted slaves were almost like shadows. One brushed and folded the toga. Another carried confidential messages. A cubicularius tended the bedroom, always near enough to hear midnight sighs. These were the ones who overheard family secrets, political schemes, and drunken rants. Did they gossip? Of course. Did they sometimes use this information for small rebellions? Also yes. A misplaced letter, a forgotten message, tiny ways to tilt the balance of a master's life. Manumission, a glimmer of freedom. For some, loyalty might pay off. Roman society encouraged freeing slaves, manumission. A faithful secretary could hope to become a freedman, officially part of his master's extended network. He wouldn't be truly independent, obligations lingered, but he could run a shop, marry, raise children, and even accumulate wealth. So when you see a senator's slave running around with nervous precision, part of that energy came from hope. Serve well, endure long enough, and maybe, just maybe, freedom was waiting at the end of the leash. Clients, the outer circle. Now, beyond the household, there was another orbit of dependency, clients. These weren't slaves. They were free men, poorer Romans, who attached themselves to wealthy patrons like senators. Every morning, they lined up outside the senator's atrium for the salutatio, the ritual greeting. Imagine a queue of shabby tunics, each man hoping for a handshake, a coin, or an invitation to dinner. Clients offered loyalty, votes, and sometimes muscle. In return, the senator gave small favors. Legal help, food baskets, or introductions. It was less friendship, more transaction. The ritual of dependence. The salutatio wasn't optional. Clients had to appear, or risk losing the senator's support. So they showed up daily, sometimes before sunrise, ready to flatter. Inside the atrium, the senator received them like a mini-king. A nod here, a kind word there. Then came the sportula, a little basket of food or coins. Enough to survive the day, not enough to escape dependence. The whole ritual was so mechanical that later writers mocked it. But for many poor Romans, it was the difference between eating and starving. The senator's perspective. To the senator, clients were both useful and annoying. They made him look powerful. A crowd trailing behind him in public was the Roman equivalent of a fan club. But they also demanded attention. Too many could clog the atrium like traffic. Too few could signal weakness. So senators cultivated the right balance, managing their clientele like gardeners trimming hedges. Not too wild, not too sparse, just thick enough to impress the neighbors. The invisible burden. Slaves and clients lived in the senator's shadow, but they carried his reputation on their backs. If his slaves were sloppy, his house looked disorderly. If his clients were too scruffy, his morning procession looked pitiful. The senator's honor wasn't just about him, it was about the silent army of dependents orbiting his life. Which meant their daily grind, their little gestures, their survival, all fed into his political image. A glimpse from below. Imagine it for a moment. A kitchen slave, sweating over boiling pots while laughter rises from the banquet above. A client, clutching his spatula, pretending gratitude while dreaming of independence. A secretary, copying letters late into the night, wondering if tomorrow's work might earn manumission. The senator barely noticed. To him, these were background details in the theater of elite life. But without them, his world would collapse. Drifting back. So when we talk about the daily life of a senator, we have to remember it wasn't just his life. It was also the life of hundreds who carried the weight of his comfort. The baths he enjoyed, the meals he devoured, the audiences he held, all were stitched together by invisible hands. Hands that history rarely names. Hands that history rarely thanks. And yet, without them, Rome's grand marble stage would have gone dark. Stepping back from the forum. Most senators didn't resign with speeches and banners. They simply drifted out. Age, illness, or political frost pushed them aside. A younger rival grabbed the consulship. The emperor preferred fresher faces. Suddenly, the senator found himself speaking less, attending fewer sessions, and sitting more often in the back row. For a man raised to see politics as the meaning of life, this was disorienting. Some handled it gracefully. Others sulked like retired athletes, endlessly reminding everyone of their past victories. The villa escape. The ultimate retirement prize was a villa. Picture it, wide courtyards, vineyards stretching into hills, a view of the sea if you were lucky. Here, the senator could pretend to become a philosopher, strolling gardens, dictating letters, and commenting on how the simple life was far superior to the noise of Rome. Of course, his simple life still involved dozens of slaves, imported wine, and marble dining rooms. But image was everything. Philosophical retreat, yes, but with heated baths and fresh oysters. Letters as legacy. One of the senator's favorite retirement hobbies was writing letters. Cicero practically made it an art form, endless correspondence with friends, allies, and sometimes enemies. These weren't casual notes. They were polished performances, half personal and half political, designed to be read aloud, copied, and remembered. In retirement, the pen became the senator's last weapon. Through letters, he could still influence debates, whisper opinions, and, most importantly, shape how history would remember him. Old men and philosophy. Many senators leaned harder into philosophy as they aged. Stoicism was particularly handy here. When your body ached, your influence dwindled, and your peers died off, repeating, "Endure with dignity," became soothing. Some wrote treatises, others just quoted Greek lines at dinner. Either way, philosophy let them disguise decline as wisdom. You weren't fading, you were transcending. You weren't irrelevant, you were serene. Family at the forefront. Retirement also shifted focus back to the household. Grandchildren played in the peristyle. Sons and nephews carried on the political battles. Wives, long background by ambition, became daily companions again, sometimes whether the senator liked it or not. There were family feasts, estate management disputes, and the occasional dramatic will-writing session. Because nothing animated an elderly senator quite like deciding which relative deserved the biggest slice of inheritance. The quiet business of death. Romans were remarkably pragmatic about death. An aging senator often spent his final years preparing a dignified exit. He commissioned a tomb, polished family genealogies, and perhaps wrote a pompous inscription about his virtues. He rehearsed the memory he wanted others to keep. Some faced death calmly, murmuring philosophical lines. Others clung bitterly, trying potions, healers, and prayers. Either way, the end was never far from thought. In a culture obsessed with legacy, death wasn't an interruption. It was the final performance. Memory above all. For senators, memory was the true afterlife. The tomb inscription, the statue in the forum, the name inscribed on family rolls, these were their immortality projects. A retired senator strolling his villa path wasn't just smelling roses. He was calculating, would his grandchildren still honor his name? Would his deeds still be recited at funerals? Or would he vanish, like so many others, into the gray dust of forgotten marble busts? That fear, more than old age itself, haunted the twilight years. The final drift. So picture it. An old senator, hair white, sitting under a fig tree in his villa. He sips watered wine, watching the horizon fade. He tells a visitor, perhaps a grandson, about the old days in the forum, about great speeches, about friends long gone. He sounds calm, dignified, perhaps even wise. But behind it all is a quiet truth: he is no longer the man in the marble halls. He is only the memory of one. And soon, even that memory will belong to others. And so, the daily life of a Roman senator was never just about law, politics, or power. It was about image. From the early mornings in the forum, to the rituals at home, to the banquets, to the whispered letters in retirement, every detail was staged for memory. Slaves carried it. Clients displayed it. Philosophy justified it. Villas decorated it. And tombs sealed it. In the end, the senator lived less as a man and more as a performance. A performance for Rome, for family, for the gods, and, most of all, for history. And tonight, as we let the story fade, we leave him there, in the quiet of his villa, drifting toward the afterlife he hoped would remember his name. A day in long view. The senator's day, like his life, was a ritual. He woke surrounded by slaves, greeted by clients, wrapped in the stiff folds of his toga. He walked into marble halls, spoke in heavy sentences, debated, schemed, and postured. He dined lavishly at night, quoted philosophy with one hand while grabbing figs with the other. Then he drifted to sleep, only to do it all again. From the outside, it looked powerful. From the inside, it was simply routine. A web of dependence. For all his marble statues and ancestral pride, the senator lived in a web of dependence. He depended on slaves for every comfort, on clients for every show of power, on omens for every decision, on the emperor's mood for every political future. Even his sense of dignity required constant performance, constant feeding, like a fragile flame. In theory, he was master of the world. In practice, he was just another actor on Rome's crowded stage. Philosophy as pillow. The senator loved to recite stoic lines about fate, about virtue, about the fleeting nature of life. But philosophy was less a way of living than a kind of pillow. It softened the edges of fear. It made decline sound noble. It helped disguise ambition as wisdom. And in that way, it was not so different from his toga, a fabric wrapped around him, stiff and ceremonial, hiding the body underneath. Family shadows. At home, family was both comfort and competition. Sons carried ambition forward, daughters carried alliances into other houses, and wives carried the burden of keeping everything stitched together. Behind closed doors, the senator was less a titan and more a tired father, a worried husband, sometimes a bitter old man. His family saw him without the marble, without the forum glow. Just another Roman struggling to balance pride with patience. What the world saw. In the forum, though, the performance never slipped. Colleagues saw dignity, clients saw power, slaves saw authority. Statues captured him forever in stern poses, inscriptions listed virtues he might or might not have possessed. The world rarely glimpsed the human underneath. Rome didn't care for humans. Rome cared for roles. And the senator, like everyone else, played his part. Death and the dream of memory. In the end, the senator's greatest fear wasn't pain, exile, or even assassination. It was being forgotten. So he built monuments, wrote letters, performed rituals, and filled his villa with marble busts of ancestors. He wanted his name carried forward, recited in ceremonies, etched in stone. Because for Romans, memory was immortality. Whether or not it worked, history rarely says. For every Cicero we still remember, there were hundreds of senators whose names dissolved into dust. But in his own twilight, the senator believed he would endure. That belief was enough to soothe him. And so he fades. So now, as the narration quiets, picture him not in the forum, not in the Senate house, but in his villa at dusk. The olive trees dark against the horizon, the cicadas soft, the marble colonnade cooling under night air. He sits with a cup of watered wine, speaking half to himself, half to the ghosts of ancestors. He feels old, but also strangely calm. The empire will go on without him, the Senate will fill with younger men, the debates will roar again. He will fade into memory, as all senators do. And Rome will keep turning. A whispered goodnight. The daily life of a Roman senator wasn't glorious, or even enviable, when stripped of marble and myth. It was heavy with duty, with ritual, with endless dependence. A life spent performing power, while privately fearing its loss. And yet, in that endless performance, something very human glows through, the hunger to matter. To be remembered. To leave a trace in a world that forgets so quickly. That hunger makes the senator not just Roman, not just elite, but recognizably one of us. And with that thought, let's let him rest. The lamps are out, the atrium is dark, the city sleeps. Good night, Senator. Good night, Rome. Morning streets. When the senator left his domus at dawn, he stepped not into silence but into a city already buzzing. Bakers stoked ovens, donkeys clattered down cobblestones, hawkers shouted the day's wares. The air was thick, wood smoke, roasting bread, maybe sewage if the drains weren't working well that week. Rome was magnificent from a distance, but up close it smelled very much alive. Our senator, wrapped in toga folds, walked past it all with practiced indifference. Ordinary Romans stared, perhaps muttered, but they made way. A senator on his way to the Forum was part of the city's theater, a marble figure gliding through chaos. Monuments as memory. Every step through Rome was a reminder of history. Temples gleamed with sacrifices, triumphal arches boasted of victories, old Republican halls whispered of ancestors. For the senator, the city wasn't just geography. It was a mirror of ambition. He saw the names of dead consuls carved in stone and thought of his own family. He saw statues of generals and wondered which of his descendants might earn one. Walking through Rome was like walking through a scrapbook of glory. And every senator dreamed of adding his own page. The Forum as heartbeat. The Forum wasn't simply a workplace. It was the city's heartbeat. There were basilicas for legal cases, temples for ceremonies, open spaces for gossip. Senators argued, merchants haggled, philosophers muttered to anyone who would listen. It was both parliament and marketplace, both theater and back alley. Our senator moved through it like an actor who knew the stage well. He might pause at a temple step, exchange greetings, or let himself be seen by the right crowd. Even standing silently in the Forum was a kind of performance. The noise of the masses. But senators didn't own Rome alone. The city teemed with ordinary people, artisans, freedmen, beggars, children darting through alleys. Crowds could turn into mobs in moments. A shortage of grain, a rumor of corruption, a festival gone wrong, suddenly thousands of voices shouted as one. Senators feared the masses, yet depended on them for stability. So each day, as our senator walked through the city, he carried that tension. Admired, perhaps. Envied, certainly. But never fully secure. Because the crowd was always watching. The luxuries of the city. For all its noise, Rome offered delights. Public baths, theaters, circuses, markets stocked with spices from India and glass from Alexandria. A senator might enjoy a play, a gladiatorial spectacle, or a leisurely stroll through porticos lined with statues. Rome was the empire's beating heart, and senators had front-row seats. Every corner reminded them of wealth, conquest, and connections far beyond Italy. Yet behind the grandeur, the streets were uneven, the water sometimes foul, the smells unavoidable. Luxury and filth mingled daily. The senator simply learned to glide above it. Nightfall in the capital. At night, Rome shifted again. The Forum emptied, markets closed, lamps flickered along narrow streets. Taverns buzzed with laughter, dice games, and cheap wine. Meanwhile, senators retreated to candlelit banquets, safe behind guarded doors. But the city outside was never silent. Carts rattled, dogs barked, drunken voices drifted through alleys. Even in sleep, the senator lived in a city that refused to rest. Rome as reflection. For the senator, Rome was both cradle and cage. Its monuments told him who to be, its crowds reminded him of his fragility, its grandeur promised him immortality if only he played his part well enough. Every marble column whispered, "Your name could last forever." Every crumbling wall reminded him, "Or it could fade tomorrow." The city itself was a daily sermon in ambition, vanity, and impermanence. Drifting out of the city. And so, when he finally retreated to his villa in retirement, part of him missed the noise. The shouting, the processions, even the smell of bread mixed with sewage, it was the pulse of his world. The villa was peaceful, yes. But Rome had been alive. And without it, the senator sometimes felt he was already halfway to being forgotten. The final picture. So if you imagine the senator's daily life, don't picture him only in the Senate House or reclining at dinner. Picture him walking through Rome, past temples, markets, and crowds. A small figure in a sprawling city, always performing, always being watched. Because the senator's life wasn't just his own. It was woven into Rome itself, a city that shaped him, displayed him, and eventually buried him in its endless layers of history. The endless festival year. To a senator, the Roman calendar wasn't just dates and months. It was a patchwork quilt of religious festivals, civic ceremonies, and imperial spectacles. Some were ancient, tied to gods like Jupiter and Mars. Others were newer, tacked on to flatter emperors or celebrate victories. In practice, this meant that the senator's life was regularly interrupted by parades, games, sacrifices, and banquets. Imagine trying to debate land reform on a morning when half the city was outside cheering for gladiators. That was Rome. Saturnalia, when the world turned upside down. The most famous, of course, was Saturnalia in December. During this week, normal order broke down. Slaves wore their masters' clothes, gambling was allowed, and everyone gave cheap little gifts, wax candles, clay figurines, nuts. For senators, it was a delicate balancing act. You had to play along, laughing when a slave sat at the banquet table, or when someone mocked your toga. But you also had to keep things from going too far. Think of it as a Roman version of office holiday parties. Everyone pretended it was wild fun, but you were still being watched. Triumphs, politics in parade form. When generals returned victorious, they could be granted a triumph, a lavish parade through Rome. Senators didn't ride in these parades unless they were the honoree, but they did attend, watching from reserved spots. The triumph was a reminder of Rome's power, but also of the honoree's rising prestige. For the senator, clapping along wasn't just civic duty. It was networking. Who you congratulated, how loudly you applauded, and where you sat all mattered. Even parades were politics. The ludi, games for the masses. Several times a year, the ludi, public games, took over the city. Chariot races in the Circus Maximus, theatrical plays, gladiatorial shows. These events lasted for days, sometimes weeks. The senator's role was to be visible. You showed up, nodded gravely, and let the people see that Rome's elite supported their fun. If you were especially ambitious, you might sponsor games yourself, footing the bill for free bread and spectacles. It was expensive, but the crowd loved it. And being loved by the crowd meant votes, or at least less risk of being pelted with turnips during shortages. Religious rites in public. Then there were the quieter festivals, sacred days tied to temples, gods, and old rituals. Senators often had to officiate. Standing in front of an altar, sacrificing a bull, reciting formulas word for word. If you got the words wrong, the whole ritual had to be repeated. Not exactly relaxing. These ceremonies reminded everyone that senators weren't just politicians. They were guardians of Rome's pact with the gods. And heaven forbid you sneezed in the middle of one. The emperor's celebrations. By the imperial age, festivals weren't just about gods anymore. They were about emperors. Birthdays, anniversaries, family victories, all became excuses for games and parades. Senators dutifully attended, applauding the imperial family while pretending it was spontaneous joy. It wasn't really optional. Missing the emperor's festival was like skipping your boss's wedding anniversary dinner, multiplied by about 1,000. Behind the glitter. For ordinary Romans, festivals meant real joy, free food, days off, wild parties. For senators, it was more complicated. Festivals meant being seen, performing piety, and carefully balancing between indulgence and dignity. Drink too little, you looked stiff. Drink too much, you looked sloppy. Clap too loudly, you looked desperate. Clap too softly, you looked seditious. It was, in short, exhausting. The year in review. So, over the course of a year, the senator's life wasn't just debates, lawsuits, and banquets. It was punctuated by waves of ritual celebration, Saturnalia's chaos, triumphal parades, sacred sacrifices, endless games. Each festival was different, but the senator's role was the same: be present, be visible, and play the part Rome expected of him. Drifting back to quiet. And when it was all over, when the parades ended, the torches burned out, and the streets went dark again, the senator returned home, tired from clapping, smiling, and sacrificing in perfect proportion. Rome's festivals might have looked joyful. For him, they were just another stage in the performance of power. Still, perhaps on some Saturnalia night, after too much wine, he really did laugh at a joke from one of his slaves. Maybe, for a fleeting moment, he even enjoyed it. But then the lamps dimmed, and duty began again the next morning. Why leave Rome at all? For a senator, Rome was everything: politics, prestige, business. But it was also crowded, noisy, and filthy. Picture narrow streets jammed with carts, the smell of sewage on hot days, and neighbors who thought midnight flute practice was perfectly acceptable. After weeks of that, even the most ambitious senator needed an escape. So travel became part of the rhythm of life. Not adventurous travel, no cliff climbing or backpacking. Think villa hopping and riding in style. The country villa. The classic senator's escape was the country villa. These weren't humble cottages. They were sprawling estates, with marble courtyards, fish ponds, and enough guest rooms to host a small army of political allies. Life there was slower. You could read, write, or dictate letters to your secretary while reclining under a tree. Cicero famously bragged about how much better he could think outside the city. Of course, he was also making sure people knew he had multiple villas. For senators, villas weren't just retreats. They were statements, physical proof that you were wealthy enough to own land beyond the city, but tasteful enough to enjoy the countryside like a philosopher. Seaside escapes. If the country villa was good, the seaside villa was better. The Italian coast glittered with estates where senators could sip wine while watching the sunset over the Mediterranean. Places like Baiae near Naples were notorious. Think of it as the Roman Riviera, luxurious, scandalous, and always fashionable. Senators lounged in heated pools, attended endless dinner parties, and showed off their art collections. But, as always, politics followed. Who you visited, who visited you, and what gossip was whispered over oysters all fed back into Roman life. The inconvenient journey. Getting there, however, wasn't glamorous. Roman travel was slow. The average land speed of a senator's entourage was basically plodding donkey pace. Roads were good, yes, but comfort was limited. Carriages were bumpy, inns were grim, and roadside food was, let's just say, nobody wrote poetry about it. Senators often brought their own cooks, bedding, and even chamber pots to avoid local accommodations. Imagine an elite Roman caravan dragging along half a household just to spend a week at the seaside. That was normal. The postal system, for emperors only. There was an official courier system, but it was meant for the emperor and his administrators. A senator couldn't just drop a letter into the imperial post. Instead, he relied on slaves, messengers, or friends traveling in the right direction. This meant that travel wasn't just about moving yourself. It was about moving your network, letters, instructions, bribes, and favors. Trips to the provinces. Sometimes, senators had to travel further. A governorship could send them to the far edges of the empire. Asia Minor, Spain, North Africa, beautiful places, yes, but also responsibilities. Traveling there meant months on the road, dealing with rough seas, or endless stretches of Roman highways. You brought an entourage, of course, but it was still exhausting. And yet, these trips were profitable. Governors collected gifts from cities and sometimes squeezed locals for more. A senator might return richer than ever, or in trouble with the law if he pushed too far. Vacations or exile? There's also the less pleasant kind of travel. When emperors grew suspicious, senators were often invited to leave Rome. Officially, it might be framed as retirement at your villa. Unofficially, it was exile. One day you're debating in the Senate, the next you're stuck in Sicily with orders not to return. A forced vacation, with none of the fun. The daily routine on the road. So what did a senator actually do while traveling? Not much different from Rome: read, dictate letters, oversee business. But there were also new distractions: fishing trips, countryside walks, maybe inspecting local farms. And always, there was dining. Banquets traveled with the senator, so even far from Rome, the eating and drinking continued. It wasn't exactly camping. Travel as performance. It's easy to think of senatorial travel as private, but it was always public. People saw your villa, your entourage, your generosity in the provinces. Even leisure was a form of politics. If you entertained lavishly at your villa, word spread back to Rome. If you traveled humbly, that was noted too. Every choice reflected on your reputation. Drifting home again. Eventually, the senator returned to the city. Rome always pulled him back, for debates, lawsuits, festivals, imperial demands. The countryside offered calm, the seaside offered luxury, the provinces offered profit. But Rome offered power. And for a senator, power was the only real destination. So, weary from the journey, his entourage unpacked, the letters piled up on his desk, and life in the capital resumed. Marriage as strategy. For Roman senators, marriage wasn't about romance. It was about alliances. Your wife wasn't just a partner. She was a connection to another powerful family. Marrying well could boost your career, add dowries to your estate, and expand your political network. It wasn't unusual for senators to marry multiple times, especially if widowed. Each marriage was another chance to secure influence. And yes, age gaps could be absurd. A graying senator might wed a teenage bride because her father was politically useful. Love rarely entered the equation. The senator's wife. That said, wives weren't just passive ornaments. A senatorial wife was expected to run the household. A job that meant overseeing dozens, sometimes hundreds, of slaves. She supervised the kitchens, the laundry, the storerooms, the children's tutors, the household physicians, and the constant flow of guests. It was like managing a small business empire, except your employees were legally property. Some wives also had reputations as advisors, whispering counsel into their husbands' ears. Others were notorious for scandals, affairs, divorces, or political meddling. Romans didn't idealize marriage as forever. Divorce was easy and common. If alliances shifted, so did marriages. Children, future senators in training. For a senator, children weren't just family. They were investments. A son was the future, the heir to your name, wealth, and political career. From birth, he was trained to carry on your role. Tutors taught him Greek, Latin, law, and rhetoric. By his teens, he was already practicing speeches and watching debates. Daughters, meanwhile, were marriage alliances waiting to happen. Their upbringing focused less on politics and more on preparing them to be suitable wives, literate enough to seem cultured, modest enough to look respectable, and rich enough to attract good matches. It sounds bleak, but that was the senatorial family model, children as dynastic chess pieces. Education in the household. Wealthy senatorial households often had private tutors. Greek slaves were prized, elegant, educated, and, supposedly, good influences on the children. Boys learned not only academics but also how to speak in public, how to manage estates, and how to command authority. Girls were sometimes taught literature and philosophy, but only as far as it made them more refined companions. A senator's house was essentially a miniature academy, shaping heirs for their destined roles. Domestic rituals. Family life also had a religious rhythm. Household gods, the Laras and Penates, had shrines inside the home. Daily rituals and offerings tied the family to its ancestors. Even the senator himself might pause, dropping incense on a flame before heading off to the forum. Marriage, birth, and coming-of-age ceremonies all carried heavy ritual weight. A senator's family wasn't just private, it was a tiny religious unit, performing Rome's sacred traditions on a smaller scale. The awkward reality. Of course, reality didn't always match the ideal. Some senators ignored their wives, chasing mistresses, slave girls, or boys. Some families collapsed into scandal, with divorces aired in public like courtroom dramas. Others faced tragedy, high infant mortality, plagues, political assassinations. Even the most powerful families weren't immune to heartbreak. One year your son was studying to be the next Cicero, the next he was struck down by fever. Life in ancient Rome, even for the elite, was fragile. The role of women behind the curtain. Though they couldn't hold office, senatorial wives could wield soft power. Hosting dinners, shaping alliances through marriage negotiations, or quietly funding projects, women were part of the machinery of Roman politics, even if history often left them unnamed. Some even became infamous for it. Think of women like Livia, wife of Augustus, who was whispered to have manipulated half the imperial family tree. Not every senator's wife was a schemer, but the stereotype existed for a reason. Family reputation. For a senator, family reputation was everything. One scandal could ripple through generations. If your daughter divorced too many times, if your son gambled away his allowance, if your household became known for cruelty, it all stuck. Romans were obsessed with ancestry. Your family name wasn't just personal. It was a brand, and the Senate was the showroom floor. The quiet end of the day. So at the end of a long day, our senator might return home to his villa, eat supper with his wife, nod approvingly at his children's lessons, and say a quick prayer at the family shrine. To outsiders, it looked ideal: noble husband, dutiful wife, promising heirs. Inside, it was messy, full of negotiations, expectations, and unspoken tensions. But as always in Rome, appearance mattered more than reality. As long as the family looked strong, the senator's power remained secure. The divorce machine. Let's start with divorce. Romans didn't really do, till death do us part. Marriage was a contract, and contracts could be cancelled. If a senator wanted a new alliance, or just got tired of his wife, he could simply send her a message: keep your things. And that was it. It wasn't just men either. Elite women, if their families backed them, could divorce too. Cicero's wife Terentia reportedly divorced him after decades of marriage. Apparently, even Rome's greatest orator couldn't talk his way out of that one. For senators, divorces could pile up. Marry for politics, divorce for politics, marry again. It wasn't unusual to have multiple wives over a lifetime, each one a rung on the social ladder. Romantic, it was not. Affairs and adulteries. Of course, divorce didn't stop anyone from having affairs. Senators kept mistresses, dalliances with slave women, or flirtations with courtesans. Affairs among the elite were so common they barely raised eyebrows, unless they involved the wrong person. Sleeping with another senator's wife. Dangerous. Sleeping with the emperor's wife. Fatal. For wives, adultery was even riskier. A husband might tolerate gossip about himself, but a wife's infidelity threatened family honor. Augustus famously passed laws punishing adultery, though ironically, his own daughter was caught in multiple affairs. Rome loved hypocrisy almost as much as it loved wine. Children and tragedy. Even without scandals, family life could collapse under tragedy. Infant mortality was brutally high. Senators buried children as often as they celebrated them. Small tombstones lined the roads outside Rome, carved with heartbreaking epitaphs: little boys who never spoke their first words, daughters who died before their weddings. For the survivors, life wasn't much easier. A senator's son could fall in battle, be exiled for politics, or simply waste away from illness. Daughters might be married off at 14, only to die in childbirth at 15. The senator's household might look glamorous, but grief was a constant guest at the table. Feuds within the family. Then there were family feuds. Sons who resented their fathers, brothers who quarreled over inheritance, uncles who schemed against nephews. With money and power on the line, even blood ties were fragile. Some senators were assassinated not by political rivals, but by their own relatives. Others found themselves dragged into court by brothers or cousins over estates. Roman law was filled with family suing family, turning the courts into a soap opera of betrayal. The Empress of Scandal, wives in the spotlight. Sometimes, scandals centered on wives. Clodius Pulcher, a notorious senator, was caught sneaking into a women-only religious festival disguised as a woman, allegedly to seduce Caesar's wife Pompeia. Caesar divorced her afterward, coining the famous phrase that a senator's wife must be above suspicion. But suspicion was always there. Every whispered affair, every lavish party, every hint of impropriety could tarnish a senator's reputation through his wife's actions. Public shaming. Rome didn't hide scandals, it paraded them. Divorces were discussed openly in the Senate. Affairs became dinner-table gossip. Satirists like Juvenal made entire careers mocking the personal lives of the elite. If you slipped up, everyone knew. For a senator, family life wasn't private. It was public theater, and the audience was merciless. The weight of appearances. And yet, through it all, appearances mattered more than reality. A senator could be miserable in his marriage, but as long as he dined with his wife in public, the facade held. A son could gamble away his allowance, but if he gave a halfway decent speech in the forum, people looked the other way. The family didn't have to be happy. It just had to look intact. Quiet sorrows. But when the banquets ended, when the lamps burned low, the senator might sit awake, weighed down by grief for a lost child, bitterness toward an unfaithful spouse, or fear of betrayal from within his own household. Rome might not have cared about private sorrow, but sorrow was there, always lurking behind the polished marble walls. And so, for every senator's family that looked like a shining model of Roman virtue, there were cracks. Divorces, deaths, scandals, and betrayals turned even the most powerful homes into fragile, haunted places. The weight of years. By the time a senator reached old age, he had lived through decades of speeches, banquets, lawsuits, and endless political maneuvering. His hair was gray, his back stooped, his voice softer. But in Rome, age was double-edged. On one hand, it brought dignity. An elder statesman was honored, his opinions respected. The Senate even gave older members the first seats in debates. On the other hand, Rome valued vigor. Too much frailty, and you became invisible. The senator had to balance the dignity of wisdom with the embarrassment of weakness. Retirement at the villa. Many senators spent their later years away from the city, retreating to country or seaside villas. There, life slowed. No more rushing to the forum at dawn. Instead, mornings were spent strolling through gardens, dictating letters, or reading Greek philosophy. The Stoics, in particular, were popular companions for old age. Their calm reflections on fate and mortality suited the mood. Aging senators liked to imagine themselves as philosophers, communing with nature while sipping watered wine. Of course, servants still scurried about, and the villas were hardly humble. Retirement was luxurious, but it was also quieter. The role of grandfather. In old age, a senator often became the patriarch of a sprawling family. Sons and daughters had their own children. Suddenly the house was filled with grandchildren, running through the courtyards, interrupting serious discussions with shouts and games. To them, he wasn't just a politician. He was the grandfather, the one who told stories of past debates, who gave advice, who scolded gently when manners slipped. Family legacy mattered more now. The senator wasn't just living for himself. He was shaping how his descendants would remember him. Old friends, old enemies. Retirement didn't erase the past. Old political allies still wrote letters, old enemies still spread gossip. A senator never fully escaped Rome. Sometimes, he returned briefly to the city to speak in the Senate or appear at a festival. The crowd might cheer, not out of relevance, but out of respect for his age. He was a relic, but a dignified one. Other times, he stayed away entirely, content to let the younger generation fight their battles. The fear of exile. But not every senator aged peacefully. Some fell out of favor with emperors. An elder statesman who spoke too freely might find himself retired against his will, exiled to an island, or ordered to remain at his villa, forbidden to return to Rome. Old age didn't guarantee safety. It only made the fall harder, because the years left to recover were short. Reflections on mortality. Inevitably, old senators thought about death. Roman culture was steeped in memory of ancestors, in funerals, in tombs. An aging senator would plan his own, the inscriptions, the statues, the family mausoleum. He wanted to be remembered not just as a man, but as part of an unbroken lineage stretching back centuries. Some were stoic, accepting death calmly. Others clung to life, surrounding themselves with doctors, remedies, and prayers. But all knew the same truth: Rome moved on quickly. Today you were the elder statesman. Tomorrow, you were a name on a tombstone. The funeral. When a senator finally died, his funeral was another performance. The body was carried through the forum, accompanied by mourners. Professional actors might wear wax masks of his ancestors, parading his lineage before the people. Speeches praised his virtues, his offices, his service to Rome. The burial or cremation followed, with offerings to the gods and feasts for the family. It was both mourning and spectacle, the final stage of a senator's public life. What remained? And then, silence. The senator's villa passed to his heirs. His seat in the Senate was taken by another. His statues gathered dust, his name slowly faded from memory. Perhaps a few lines in a historian's book kept him alive, but Rome rarely paused for long. Still, for his family, his legacy endured. His sons and grandsons carried his name. His daughters spread his bloodline into other noble houses. The senator might be gone, but his family remained part of Rome's eternal machine. The final drift. So the senator's life, from ambitious youth to weary elder, ended as it had been lived, a blend of duty, performance, and fragile humanity. He was born into expectation, raised for power, trained for visibility. He feasted, schemed, laughed, grieved, and aged. And in the end, like every Roman, he returned to dust. Rome went on without him. Another senator rose. Another debate began. But for one long life, full of banquets and speeches, festivals and journeys, family joys and family sorrows, he had played his part. And perhaps, in the quiet of his final days, that was enough. 2 Romes in one city. Rome wasn't one city. It was 2. For the senator, Rome meant marble temples, political debates, golden couches, and endless dinners. For the majority of Romans, it meant cramped tenement blocks, daily struggle for food, and the constant hum of survival. The senator lived on a stage of public life, where every gesture was calculated. The ordinary Roman lived off-stage, mostly invisible, except when joining the cheering crowd in the Circus Maximus. 2 Romes, side by side, each pretending the other wasn't so different. Housing, palaces and tenements. A senator's domus was sprawling, courtyards, fountains, libraries. Most Romans, however, lived in insulae, apartment blocks that could be 5 or 6 stories high. Wooden stairs creaked, walls crumbled, fires broke out. Families squeezed into single rooms, often without kitchens. The senator might complain about noisy neighbors on the Palatine Hill. But an ordinary Roman dealt with rats, leaking roofs, and the risk that his building might literally collapse. Food, banquets versus bread. We've seen the senator's endless banquets, roasted peacocks, honeyed dormice, wine poured by the jug. For most Romans, dinner was bread, porridge, maybe a few olives or a scrap of cheese. Meat was rare, a festival treat. Wine was cheap and watered down, sometimes sour. When the grain supply faltered, senators worried about riots. Ordinary Romans worried about starving. Work and idleness. The senator's work was politics, speeches, lawsuits, rituals. It was exhausting in its way, but it didn't involve physical labor. Ordinary Romans worked as craftsmen, laborers, dockhands, or shopkeepers. Their hands were calloused, their backs bent. If they were lucky, they might earn enough to avoid debt. If not, they risked being sold into slavery. The senator's idle stroll in his garden was another man's dream day off. Slavery, owners and the owned. Senators owned dozens, sometimes hundreds, of slaves. They cooked, cleaned, taught children, even copied books. A senator might write long letters about the philosophical meaning of life, dictated to a slave who wasn't free to live his own. For the majority of Rome's population, freedom was precarious. Slaves formed the silent backbone of the economy. Freedmen, once slaves, worked as clients, clinging to patrons for protection. The senator's comfort rested squarely on their labor. Entertainment, front row and cheap seats. When the games were held, senators had reserved marble seats close to the action. They arrived in fine togas, surrounded by clients, nodding gravely as the crowd roared. Ordinary Romans crammed into wooden bleachers high above, jostling for space. For them, the games were escape, a rare joy. For the senator, they were obligation, another stage to be seen, another role to play. Both groups cheered the same chariots. But they weren't cheering from the same world. Religion, public and private. For senators, religion meant public sacrifices, processions, and festivals, grand displays in temples, always watched. For ordinary Romans, religion was smaller. Household shrines, street corner offerings, prayers whispered for safe childbirth or enough food tomorrow. Both lived under the same gods, but their relationships to them were entirely different. The illusion of unity. Rome liked to imagine itself as one family, senators and plebs, patricians and slaves, all under the same eagle standards. In truth, the gap was enormous. Senators lived lives of luxury, politics, and constant performance. Ordinary Romans lived lives of labor, scarcity, and anonymity. Yet, strangely, they shared the same city, the same festivals, the same spectacles. For a moment in the Circus Maximus, when a chariot thundered past, senator and plebeian shouted as one. But when the dust settled, each returned to his world. The senator's place in memory. Today, we remember the senators. Their names are carved on monuments, their letters survive, their villas are dug up by archaeologists. The ordinary Romans. Their names are lost, their stories erased. The silence of history swallows them. That's the final irony. Senators lived lives of privilege but constant anxiety about appearances. Ordinary Romans lived lives of hardship, but without the burden of constant scrutiny. Both lives ended the same way, with death and fading memory. Drifting to a close. So as we close the long, slow journey through the daily life of a senator, remember the contrast. The marble villas, the glittering banquets, the endless debates, all stood atop the sweat of millions unseen. The senator may have felt himself immortal in marble halls, but he was just as mortal as the baker, the soldier, or the slave. And when the lamps dimmed, when the city quieted under the night sky, Rome belonged to everyone, senator and plebeian alike. And perhaps, in that rare moment of silence, they weren't so different after all. Living in a theater. Every senator lived in a play. Not the funny kind with masks and slapstick actors, but a slow, serious production where every movement mattered. When he walked through the forum, he knew eyes were on him. If he strolled too quickly, he seemed nervous. Too slowly, he seemed pompous. If he laughed, it had to be measured, the right amount of mirth, never too much. It wasn't just a life. It was a performance. Anxiety over reputation. Romans called it dignitas. Dignity, prestige, the aura of respect that clung to a man's name. For a senator, dignitas was life itself. Lose it, and you might as well crawl into exile. Gain it, and your descendants would thank you forever. That's why senators obsessed over reputation. A small scandal could stain a family for generations. A bad speech in the Senate could haunt a man more than losing a fortune. A stumble at a festival could be retold with snickers long after he was gone. Sleep came slowly in Rome, especially if your enemies were whispering about you in dark corners. The burden of family. A senator was never just himself. He was his ancestors, his household, his future children, his clients, and his name. When he entered the Senate, he carried the shadows of long-dead relatives behind him. Busts of ancestors lined his home, silently reminding him not to embarrass the family. Even in private moments, he was rarely free. His wife might remind him of expectations, his slaves might overhear his doubts, his rivals might twist his words. Every senator was haunted by family, both the living and the dead. Ambition, always. Of course, senators wanted power. They claimed to act for the republic, for the gods, for tradition. But ambition hummed beneath every toga. The consulship was the dream. To reach it meant parades, fame, and one's name etched into Rome's official memory. To fail was to live forever in someone else's shadow. Some senators were cautious, taking small steps up the ladder. Others were reckless, burning bridges just to climb higher. A few, like Cicero, lived their entire lives nervously trying to hold on to their fragile peak. Ambition wasn't just a goal. It was the air they breathed. The fear of falling. But ambition came with its twin, fear. A senator could be stripped of office, disgraced, even exiled. He could lose wealth in a bad investment, or fall victim to a political purge. One wrong alliance, one insult at the wrong time, and decades of careful posturing could vanish. So senators lived with constant anxiety. They smiled at rivals they despised. They praised laws they hated. They voted in ways that kept them alive politically, even if their conscience squirmed. The toga looked calm. The mind inside it rarely was. Stoic poses, real nerves. Philosophy was fashionable among senators. Reading Stoic works, quoting Epicurus, dabbling in Aristotle. But philosophy often stopped at the front door. A senator might talk grandly about virtue, fate, and the calm acceptance of death. Then he'd panic when his reputation dipped, or when a rival gained too many clients. It was easier to look wise than to feel wise. Legacy dreams. At night, in the quiet of the atrium, a senator dreamed of legacy. Would his sons continue the family line in office? Would his name be remembered kindly? Would marble statues carry his likeness through time? Romans believed memory was a second life. To be forgotten was a kind of death. That's why senators built villas, wrote speeches, and carved inscriptions. They weren't just living in the present, they were trying desperately to live forever. Some succeeded. Many failed. Most were swallowed by time. Closing reflection. So if the senator's daily life seemed full of feasts, speeches, and posturing, beneath it lay constant worry. The performance of dignity, the shadow of ambition, the ache of fear. He was powerful, yes. But also fragile. A single scandal, a single misstep, and he could tumble into obscurity. That's the hidden truth of Rome's elite. Beneath the marble and gold, they were anxious actors, afraid of the curtain falling too soon. And perhaps that's what makes them human, across all these centuries. Senators fretted about their reputations. We fret about our emails, our social media posts, our jobs. Different stage, same nerves. So, as the oil lamp dims, let's leave our senator sitting in his atrium, staring at the busts of his ancestors. Wondering if he's worthy. Wondering if he'll be remembered. Wondering, in the quiet, if any of it really mattered. The long shadow of youth. When a senator grew old, he carried the shadow of his younger self like an annoying ghost. He remembered fiery speeches, packed courts, clients queuing at his door. He remembered when his name stirred whispers in the forum, when people leaned in to hear his opinion. Now, younger senators dominated the debates, strutting in with booming voices, eager to impress. He sat there in the curule seat, toga still crisp, but his words carried less weight. The Republic was brutal that way, yesterday's star was today's background prop. Ritual of respect. Roman culture demanded respect for age. In theory, older senators were honored as living monuments of wisdom. They were called patres conscripti, the fathers of the state. In practice, they were often treated like ceremonial furniture. Younger men nodded politely, deferred in words, but ignored in deeds. The old senator might be praised for past service, then immediately sidelined in a real decision. It was like clapping for a retiring actor before pushing him off stage. The body rebels. Daily life changed when the body slowed down. The long walks through the forum became tiring. The grand banquets felt heavier on the stomach. Reading long scrolls strained the eyes. The toga, once a proud symbol, became a weight to drag around. An old senator might still try to keep the pose of dignity, trimmed beard, upright carriage, but joints creaked, hands trembled, memory slipped. Roman medicine didn't offer much beyond herbs, massages, and hopeful prayers. Aging was accepted, but rarely comfortable. The fear of irrelevance. Perhaps the sharpest sting of old age wasn't pain. It was irrelevance. Ambition fades when the consulship is out of reach. Rivalries fade when rivals are dead. What's left is watching the city move on without you. Rome never slowed down. New wars, new laws, new scandals. The old senator watched, sometimes bewildered, sometimes bitter, always aware that his time was nearly gone. It wasn't the fear of death. It was the fear of being forgotten before death even arrived. Family and continuity. The old senator's comfort was often his family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. If they carried on the family line in politics, he felt vindicated. His legacy was alive. If they failed, if they squandered wealth or lost elections, his twilight years were filled with quiet disappointment. He might spend afternoons tutoring grandsons in rhetoric, repeating the same speeches he once gave, hoping they would echo through the forum long after he was gone. Family became both solace and reminder of decline. Retirement that wasn't. Rome didn't really believe in retirement. An old senator was still expected to show up, at least occasionally, in the curia. His presence lent gravitas. His vote still counted. But mostly, he became a symbol. A gray head in the background, nodding slowly while younger men fought. The younger senators looked at him with half respect, half impatience. Like a relic, important, but in the way. Philosophical comforts. Some old senators turned more fully to philosophy. They read Stoics, quoted Plato, debated calmly with friends about fate and virtue. It was a way of preparing for death, a soft cushion of words to ease the fear. Others turned bitter, grumbling about how everything had gone downhill since their youth. That new senators lacked manners, that politics had grown corrupt, that the republic wasn't what it used to be. For the record, everyone in Rome said this, in every generation. The republic was apparently always better 20 years ago. The final banquet. When death drew near, the senator's daily life shrank. Fewer public outings. More time in the villa. Longer naps in the sunlit atrium. Visitors came, clients, friends, family, offering respect. Some meant it. Some just wanted to be seen at the deathbed of a once great man. The old senator, now frail and weary, would smile faintly, perhaps dictate a final letter, perhaps lecture one last time about dignity. And then he was gone. Memory in marble. After death, the family staged the funeral. Wax masks of ancestors were worn, parades were held, speeches given. The senator's name was praised, his deeds recited, his toga remembered. Busts were placed in the household shrine. His likeness carved in stone. His epitaph promised eternal honor. But Rome was busy. The next day, the Senate met again. The city moved on. The games continued. Another senator rose to take his seat. The old man lived only in marble and memory. Gentle closing. So the daily life of a senator ended not with a bang, but with a slow fading. From fiery speeches to faint whispers. From crowded clients to quiet gardens. From ambition to reflection. And perhaps that was the true Roman way, to spend a lifetime chasing dignitas, then spend old age wondering if it was ever really yours. The forum roared on. The city breathed. And the senator slipped quietly into the long night, joining his ancestors in the endless shadow of history. History as a second stage. For Roman senators, death wasn't really the end. Yes, the body was cremated. Yes, the ashes were tucked into urns. Yes, the family mourned. But what mattered more was the story that survived. Rome believed that memory itself was a second life. To be remembered was to live on. To be forgotten was a second death. So the senator's afterlife played out not in Elysium, but in the mouths of historians, poets, and gossipers. Funeral orations, polished lies. At the funeral, a son or relative stood up to give the laudatio funebris, the official oration. This was less about truth and more about marketing. Every achievement was polished until it gleamed. Every failure was tactfully ignored. The family line was praised as if Jupiter himself had founded it. The old senator, who once worried about scandal, was suddenly transformed into a near saint. Even if, in life, he had been petty, corrupt, or dull. Funerals were the first draft of historical revision. In the hands of historians. Later, men like Sallust, Livy, and Tacitus got their hands on senatorial lives. And here, the truth got slippery again. A senator might be praised as noble, virtuous, and patriotic. Or he might be skewered as greedy, cowardly, or self-serving. Historians wrote with agendas. Tacitus loved moral lessons. Sallust saw decline everywhere. Cicero, writing about himself, naturally, was his own best press agent. The result? The senator's reputation depended less on what he did and more on who was holding the pen. Marble, busts, and inscriptions. Of course, there were also monuments. Marble statues with stern faces. Busts lined up in family shrines. Inscriptions carved in stone, declaring offices held, victories won, honors earned. These were supposed to last forever. But Rome was a practical city. Marble got recycled into new buildings. Inscriptions were chipped away. Busts lost their labels. Soon enough, many senators became anonymous stone heads, staring blankly in museums or lying broken in fields. Their names forgotten, their stories gone. So much for immortality. The gossip after death. Even centuries later, Roman gossip survived. Letters quoted rumors. Satirists poked fun at senators long gone. Some were remembered for scandals more than achievements, the affairs, the bribery, the ridiculous feasts. Others were remembered only because they were mocked by a poet. It was a strange afterlife. A senator might strive for dignity his whole life, only to be remembered as that guy who choked on a fig or the one who cried too much in court. The collective shadow. By the imperial era, the individual senator blurred into the collective memory of the Senate. People remembered the Senate opposed Caesar, or the Senate supported Augustus. But the actual names of most senators faded into the background. The individual was swallowed by the institution. The marble curia remained, but the men inside turned into shadows. Philosophical irony. Philosophers sometimes pointed out the irony. Seneca mused that ambition for glory was pointless, because posterity would either distort your life or ignore it. Marcus Aurelius, himself an emperor, reminded readers that even the greatest men were quickly forgotten once they were dust. The senators, of course, ignored this. They still chased legacy. They couldn't help themselves. Memory in our time. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still talking about them. Not all, of course. 99% of senators are nameless to us now. But the few who stood out, Cicero, Cato, Scipio, linger in schoolbooks, museum plaques, and YouTube monologues whispered into the dark. The irony? Most of them would hate how we remember them. The details we fixate on, their scandals, their quirks, their family dramas, weren't what they wanted to be known for. But that's memory. It doesn't belong to the dead. It belongs to the living. A gentle closing thought. So the senator's afterlife was a mixed one. Funerals praised him. Historians judged him. Monuments half preserved him. Satirists mocked him. And eventually, most of it faded into silence. And yet, somehow, a whisper of his life drifts across time. Enough for us to imagine his day, his worries, his ego. Enough for us to see him, not as marble, but as human. Maybe that's the truest immortality. Not eternal glory, not endless memory, but a voice in the night reminding us, he lived, he fretted, he tried, and in the end, he was just another man under the Roman sun. The senator as a one-man business. Think of a senator less as a single person and more as a small company. He was the face of the enterprise, striding into the forum in his toga. But behind him stood an entire workforce, cooks, scribes, secretaries, tutors, bodyguards, farmers, and, of course, the mourning mob of clients. Without them, he was just another man in sandals. With them, he was Rome's elite. The daily parade of clients. We've touched before on the salutatio, that morning ritual where clients gathered in the atrium. But let's linger on it. For the senator, it was both flattering and exhausting. Each morning, he opened his doors to a line of men seeking favors, jobs, loans, introductions, even food baskets. Some were old family dependents. Others were ambitious strivers clinging to his toga. The senator had to smile, nod, and pretend to remember their names. If he gave nothing, his reputation slipped. If he gave too much, his purse suffered. The salutatio was a balancing act, generosity without bankruptcy, patronage without appearing soft. Slaves as silent machinery. The senator's real staff was enslaved. There were slaves for everything, one to hold his writing tablets, one to manage accounts, one to recite Greek poetry at dinner, one to massage his shoulders after a long Senate session. Some even specialized in arranging his toga, a surprisingly complex task. The household might include cooks, doorkeepers, gardeners, musicians, tutors for children, and scribes to copy speeches. Wealthier senators owned whole workshops of slaves, producing goods for sale. In short, the senator's comfort rested on a system of human machinery. Silent, tireless, or else, and entirely uncredited. The freedman factor. Slaves weren't the only workforce. Freedmen, former slaves now legally free, often became the senator's trusted agents. Because they owed their freedom to him, their loyalty was expected. Many ran estates, managed finances, or handled delicate negotiations. A senator could thunder about noble Roman values in the Senate while quietly relying on freedmen to keep his affairs in order. It was an open secret. Everyone knew it. Everyone pretended not to notice. The estate managers. A senator's wealth wasn't just in the city. It stretched across Italy, sometimes across provinces. Olive groves, vineyards, sheep pastures, all worked by slaves, all managed by overseers. The senator himself rarely visited. Instead, letters flew back and forth. Complaints about crop failures. Reports of disobedient slaves. Requests for funds to repair a villa roof. It was agriculture as absentee landlordism. The senator might wax poetic about rustic simplicity while sipping wine in his marble atrium, far from the dust of the fields. The scribal army. Writing was everywhere in senatorial life, speeches, letters, legal arguments. But a senator didn't personally copy endless scrolls. That's what his scribes were for. Some were educated slaves who wrote quickly in shorthand. Others polished drafts into neat final copies. A senator might dictate for hours, pacing the atrium, while weary scribes scrambled to keep up. When Cicero complained about being overworked, it wasn't his hand cramping, it was his scribes. The toga specialist. Yes, the toga really needed its own staff. A senator's toga was massive, heavy, and had to be draped just so. Too loose, and he looked sloppy. Too tight, and he looked ridiculous. So slaves carefully arranged it each morning, folding and tucking until their master looked, naturally, dignified. Roman dignity, in other words, was 20% moral fiber and 80% wardrobe management. Musicians and entertainment. Banquets required performers, flautists, singers, dancers. These were often slaves, trained to set the mood while guests reclined on couches. The senator could pontificate about Roman virtue while enjoying background music from Greece or Asia Minor. Because nothing said serious statesman like nodding along to imported tunes while gnawing a roast peacock leg. Invisible but indispensable. The senator may have thought of himself as the center of Rome, but in truth, his world was propped up by dozens, even hundreds, of invisible hands. Clients made him look important. Slaves made him comfortable. Freedmen made him efficient. Without them, his daily routine would collapse into chaos. The irony? Rome praised senators for their virtus, their manly independence. But the reality was dependence, woven deeply into every moment of their lives. Gentle drift to close. So the next time we picture a Roman senator striding through the forum, let's remember the silent crowd behind him. The toga folders, the scribes, the cooks, the estate managers, the freedmen. He lived in marble halls, yes, but he was never truly alone. His dignity was a group project. His power was teamwork he never admitted. And maybe that's the truest secret of Roman elite life, a senator's greatness wasn't really his own. It was borrowed, built on the labor of those he barely acknowledged. But he'd never say that out loud. Not in the Curia. Not in marble. Only history whispers it back. A year in motion. Romans didn't measure life in hours like we do. They measured it in seasons, festivals, harvests, and political calendars. For a senator, each season carried its own rhythms. Some months meant debates and sacrifices. Others meant escaping the city heat. The year was less a cycle of days and more a tide of obligations, rising and falling. Spring, renewal, rituals, and Senate heat. Spring in Rome meant life spilling back into the streets. Markets filled, festivals multiplied, and politics reawakened after winter's slower pace. Senators began the year with rituals, sacrifices for good fortune, prayers for the state. Magistrates set up new terms of office. The Senate grew busier, debates sharper, as new proposals flowed in. Spring was also when lawsuits flourished. A senator could spend mornings in the forum, afternoons in the curia, evenings drafting speeches for the next day. His toga barely had time to rest on its stand. Summer, escape to the villas. Rome in summer was unbearable. The heat baked the city like an oven. The stench of crowded streets, sewers, and stagnant water was overwhelming. Disease lurked in the air. So senators fled. They retreated to seaside villas along the Bay of Naples, or to hill estates in cooler countryside. These villas weren't just vacation homes, they were status symbols. Terraces overlooking the sea, gardens with fountains, libraries with Greek scrolls. Here, senators relaxed with books, philosophical musings, and leisurely banquets. They still wrote letters, still received visitors, still plotted politics, but at a slower, more comfortable pace. Summer was when ambition pretended to nap. Autumn, harvests and returns. Autumn brought senators back to business. Crops ripened, estates needed overseeing, and the political season in Rome heated again. Landowners received reports of harvest yields, wheat, olives, grapes. Some traveled briefly to their estates to inspect, though usually they left the dirty work to overseers. They did, however, enjoy the harvest banquets, with new wine flowing freely. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the Senate picked up speed again. Court cases resumed. Military campaigns launched. Autumn was Rome's season of decisions. The senator who had lazed by the sea in July now polished his voice for October speeches. Winter, fires, festivals, and quiet power. Winter in Rome was chilly, damp, and dark. Senators stayed indoors, warming themselves beside braziers. The city slowed, but it didn't stop. The great festival of Saturnalia lit up December. Roles reversed, slaves feasted, and senators pretended to enjoy being equals for a few days. Gifts were exchanged, togas swapped for looser clothes, wine flowed. For once, senators could laugh a little louder without judgment. But beneath the cheer, politics never truly slept. Alliances were forged over dinner. Favors were exchanged with gifts. Senators might appear less formal, but ambition flickered like the fire in the brazier. Festivals as anchors. Throughout the year, festivals marked time as much as seasons did. The Lupercalia in February, wild with half-naked priests racing through the streets. The Vestalia in June, honoring the hearth goddess with solemn rituals. The consualia in August, when horses and mules rested from labor. For senators, these weren't just religious duties. They were photo opportunities, Roman style. Being seen at the right altar, in the right procession, mattered as much as private devotion. The calendar was a stage. Senators performed their piety on cue. The cycle of stress and escape. So a senator's year oscillated. Spring was hectic. Summer was retreat. Autumn was decisive. Winter was quieter but still political. The cycle repeated, year after year, with small variations, unless war, famine, or scandal disrupted the pattern. But even then, the seasons pulled life along. Rome might conquer the world, but no senator could conquer the calendar. A gentle closing. So when we talk about the daily life of a senator, it was never just a single day. It was the rhythm of a whole year, shifting between sweat and leisure, city and countryside, speeches and silence. Spring's urgency, summer's retreat, autumn's bustle, winter's hush. And then, like the turning of an endless wheel, it began again. Perhaps that was the only real constant in a senator's life, the knowledge that ambition might rise and fall, fortunes might soar or collapse, but the seasons would always return. The olive trees would fruit, the togas would wrinkle, the Senate would argue. And the wheel would keep turning. A state built on ritual. For Romans, religion wasn't private. It wasn't about mystical feelings or spiritual quests. It was a public contract with the gods, a constant negotiation to keep divine favor. And senators, naturally, were in the middle of it. The Senate itself often acted like a priesthood. It declared festivals, ordered sacrifices, and consulted the Sibylline books in times of crisis. Senators sat in debates, but they also stood at altars. And unlike today's politicians, they couldn't politely dodge religion. It was baked into their job description. Priesthood as career move. Many senators held priestly titles alongside political offices. There were the pontifices, guardians of religious law. The augurs, birdwatchers who interpreted omens. The quindecimviri, keepers of prophetic texts. The flamens, priests of specific gods, bound by odd taboos. These weren't mystical specialists. They were aristocrats in fancy hats. Holding a priesthood was less about devotion and more about prestige. A seat among the augurs meant visibility. A role as pontifex meant authority. And, of course, it meant yet another calendar of duties layered on top of Senate debates and client meetings. Omens everywhere. Romans believed the gods spoke constantly, usually in inconvenient ways. If lightning struck during a Senate session, bad omen, adjourn. If chickens refused to eat before battle, cancel the attack. If a magistrate tripped during a procession, probably a sign the gods were frowning. Senators were expected to take omens seriously. Or at least, to pretend they did. Which meant endless interruptions. Imagine trying to pass a budget while an augur insisted Jupiter had vetoed the day because a crow flew left. The gods, it seems, had a knack for political timing. Sacrifices, the smell of piety. Sacrifice was the heart of Roman religion. A senator spent much of his year watching, funding, or presiding over sacrifices. White bulls for Jupiter, pigs and sheep for other gods, sometimes whole banquets of animals burned on altars. Incense thick in the air, blood draining into bowls, prayers chanted in formulaic monotone. The senator rarely did the dirty work, priests and attendants handled the knives. But he had to stand there in full toga, arm raised solemnly, pretending he understood every ritual word. The catch? If a single phrase was mispronounced, the sacrifice had to start over. Which meant senators sometimes spent hours re-sacrificing sheep because someone flubbed a syllable. Divine bureaucracy at its finest. Festivals as theater. Festivals were less about piety and more about performance. Take the Lupercalia, where priests ran through the streets smacking bystanders with goat-hide whips to promote fertility. Or the Saturnalia, where senators traded their stiff togas for bright clothes and pretended to enjoy being served by their slaves. A senator couldn't just skip these. His presence was part of the ritual fabric. To miss a festival was to risk gossip. Was he impious? Disloyal? Un-Roman? So he showed up, bowed at the right moments, sacrificed when told, smiled during the parade, and quietly hoped no one noticed if he was bored. Personal shrines, public image. At home, senators also maintained lares and penates, household gods. Small shrines stood in atriums, with daily offerings of wine, bread, or incense. Of course, a senator rarely handled this himself. Slaves tended the household shrines. But during family ceremonies, weddings, births, funerals, the senator took center stage. Lighting incense, pouring libations, murmuring prayers. Even private religion doubled as public image. Guests who visited noticed the care of the shrines. Piety was reputation, and reputation was power. Religion as social glue. For all the ritual tedium, religion bound the Senate together. It gave them shared calendars, shared obligations, shared excuses. It turned politics into sacred duty. Senators could cloak ambition in divine approval, or cloak hesitation in divine warnings. A senator might grumble about yet another dawn's sacrifice, but he also knew that without ritual, Rome's political machine wouldn't run. The gods were the grease, the smoke, the stage backdrop. A quiet ending. So when we think of a senator's religion, don't imagine a man kneeling in private prayer. Imagine him instead in endless processions, his toga dragging, his expression blank, incense choking the air, the sound of cattle lowing nearby. Imagine him nodding gravely as the augur announced that Jupiter disapproved of the meeting because the sacred chickens looked cranky. And then imagine him slipping home after dark, muttering that the gods were more trouble than the Gauls. That was religion for a senator, necessary, public, and only occasionally meaningful. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share for more stories. Thanks for watching.